backlog B where they've completed their review and we have not yet finished Mommy has finished hers and then we review it. So there are different variables affecting those two dynamics. And mainly we all just kind of want to clarify our understanding of them and make sure that the county manager and board realize what resources would be needed in order to address them, and how the kind of interdynamics then affect our other operations. So in addition to not having the temporary staffing that was earlier suggested, we also still have the vacancy. The county board did interview at least one of the two candidates and suggested that they should be able to get a recommendation approved by our next meeting. So we have two great candidates, and we'll look forward to kind of an update on that. So we've got a slightly larger margin in terms of attendance and flexibility, but I do really want to echo my gratitude that everyone has made this schedule work. This backlog, I don't believe that this pace is going to work and be sustainable in the long term, but I think we are all invigorated by kind of building out and hardening these processes so that they're more reliable in terms of timing and predictability and all of that stuff, so we don't feel rushed or like we have unnecessary friction coming into these. So the challenge is that absent additional resources, some of our processes are where we would like to extend, more time and coordination in advance of these investigation reviews. And if we are both subject to the time pressure of clearing out the backlog and not given additional resources, what the 7 or 8 of us can manage realistically is difficult. So we're working on that. We're trying to be solution and partnership oriented. But I will circulate by email the specific budget information once that's shared with me. But I know that we've had multiple kind of inquiries from the community as well about community engagement. So we have to kind of be transparent about what priorities we've been given and what resources we have to support that. So before we move to the investigation, I'll stop to see if there are any questions about that.
With regard to the member that the county board is looking to act on, is the voting or non-voting?
It's the voting member vacancy. We are still struggling to find qualified applicants. We had another person reach out, and I think it was that their experience was not from Virginia. So the challenge is everyone who requests to be considered is not qualified for a different reason, but. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
So for the purpose of this meeting, could you tell us how much was the request to the county for additional resources in the budget?
So our request was that the county approve a budget of $109,000, which is in keeping with NACOL's kind of best practice suggestion that it be 1% of ACPD's non-staffing budget, under the prerogative that we're not going to have realistic historical expenses to compare to, which is some of where their initial proposal for $40,000 came from, which is a much more administrative level budget. And for example, when we look at subject matter expertise to supplement our staff, half of that is going to go to our lawyer that we have to kind of be able to consult with to make sure that we can just be compliant with our ordinance requirements and Commonwealth law. But where we have other questions, like when ACPD says they would like our support coming up with, more proactive and open approaches to exploring bias, we would like to be able to do that, but if we don't have the resources, we can't. So I don't know what the final numbers were, but I was told, it was originally discussed that there may be a temporary solution for staffing that would help address the backlog, and that also was not provisioned for. So, okay, let's get into the investigation, and then I'll circulate that by email. If any of the board members want to go over it individually, I'm happy to set up meetings in the next week to talk through it. Okay, this, and I'm trying to get to it because this one, I think, might take some discussion. This is one member of the public, but 5 officers across 2 different stops. Everyone should have reviewed OPR and the IPA's report, but I will go ahead and give kind of an overall summary of events, so bear with me. So this complaint came from a community member who alleged being subject to disrespect, harassment, and multiple illegal searches during a stop by ACPD in Clarendon last July. This investigation includes 2 separate stops, 5 different officers. Policy violations under consideration are personal contacts, duty responsibilities, and search and seizure. Our discussion will also explore relevant facts pertaining to use of force and bias-free policing that were not included in the scope of ACPD's investigation. And we will vote on our recommendations accordingly as the board feels comfortable given the facts available. So the initial approach to the complainant, the kind of events preceding this was that a member of the public went to a bar in Clarendon and was kind of turned away for having a pistol and no ID. The member of the public contends that they were not trying to go into the bar and that was a miscommunication because they had to go back to their car to get an ID. But the facts are the member of the public was walking away from the bar and the bouncer at the bar notified officers from ACPD that someone had tried to come into the bar with a gun. So ACPD's initial officers, and we're going to refer to the officers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in kind of order in which they got involved. So the officers who were told by the bouncer communicated with other officers in the area who then were able to kind of identify who the person was that was leaving with a gun and track them down. And we have had substantial conversations with ACPD about the increasing gun-related activity and a recent shooting in the Clarendon area, and recognize that I think both the police and the community all share a strong sensitivity to gun safety, especially in crowded areas, especially where there's alcohol present, and that in those circumstances, even a lawfully held gun with a concealed carry permit cannot be brought into a facility that sells and serves alcohol. So the complainant was denied entry and was walking back towards their vehicle. They were identified by police who ran towards the complainant yelling, hey police, stop, get on the ground right now, get the fuck all the way on the ground. If you reach for a gun, I'm gonna shoot you in the fucking head. Do you understand that? From the body-worn camera footage, where it is dark and the person is at the onset farther away, you can clearly see the complainant put their hands in the air the second time the officer yells stop, and they did proceed to get on the ground with their hands on their head and complied with subsequent orders from Officer 4. In their interview, Officer 4 states that when they identified the complainant, a black man wearing a white tank top and a red bandana at the roadside, they suspected the complainant was running from the police. Officer 4 did note that there was a recent shooting in the area and that there had been an increase in local gun violence, that it struck him as weird that the complainant had a gun and no ID. So ACPD's report notes that officers developed a reasonable articulable suspicion that the complainant had committed or may commit a criminal act, and therefore an investigatory detention was warranted. So once Officer 4 has kind of secured the compliance of the complainant on the ground, they're handcuffed and lifted to his feet. Officers 1 and 2 arrive. Officer 1 begins leading the kind of questioning of the complainant about their concealed weapons permit, which was on a lanyard around the complainant's neck that the officers were able to review. But as we said, he didn't have his ID with him. So they walk to his vehicle to try to get the ID, where they have additional conversation. Initially, the officers asked for consent to enter the vehicle. The complainant did give consent specifically for the officer to get the ID from the car after there was some back and forth where the complainant wanted to get their own ID And the officer said, I'm not worried about a blunt or anything. Officer 1 said, I just want to explain, we're just worried about another gun. We need to make sure you're a good guy, that's all, but whenever you're trying to get into a bar with it, and the conversation was cut off there. Officer 1 was pointing to the Virginia Code on prohibited contact, which stipulates that a person permitted to carry a concealed handgun who is under the influence of alcohol or illegal drugs while carrying such a handgun in public is guilty of a Class 1 misdemeanor, and also that no person who carries a concealed handgun on the premises of any restaurant or club for which a license to sell and serve alcoholic beverages for on-premise consumption. So the complainant later submitted willingly to a breathalyzer. Their Bay AC was 0.032, which is less than half the established legal limit. But the law that Officer 1 was pointing to does not specifically define what under the influence means. The complainant did not enter the bar, but Officer 1 pointed out that the complainant was not in compliance with the concealed weapons permit requirement that you have identification on your person so that officers or others are able to verify that you are the rightful and legal carrier of that weapon. During this exchange, there were some comments made to the complainant asking about how far they were parked from the club, why they were trying to get in. I think the complainant kind of maintained that there was a miscommunication that they weren't trying to enter the bar. Officer 4 asked whether or not the complainant had beef with someone or if his baby mama was inside the club. Officers 1, 2, and 4 questioned the complainant about a series of topics, whether he'd been drinking that night, had previously been arrested or been to court, about his employment, whether he had access to people's homes or quarter-drawn vending machines. And the complainant's initial discussion and the interaction between officers and the complainant was evasive. The complainant didn't answer the questions in a way that facilitated a sense of trust between the officers, where the officers were then pulling information from databases that contradicted the initial answers the complainant gave about whether or not he'd ever been arrested or been to court. The complainant explained that he had served 6 months in jail before turning 18, and that those records had been expunged, that he was now 37 and had not been arrested or convicted for anything else in his adult life. The officers kind of honed in on a search hit for a DUI in Las Vegas, somebody with the same name and date of birth, and the complainant was very insistent multiple times that he'd never been to Vegas, he didn't have a driver's license at that time, and he'd never been stopped driving. So the complainant did allude to the fact that his reluctance to provide this information was that it can create confusion around his ability to hold a concealed carry permit. If he'd been convicted of a felony, he wouldn't be eligible to hold that permit. So Officer 2 asked if there were firearms, narcotics, or large amounts of U.S. currency in the car. The complainant said no. Officer 1 said, "Why should I believe you?" Officer 2 also questioned the complainant about their access to other people's homes through their job, where they were there any quarter-based vending machines, because the complainant had quarters in their pocket. Officer 1 asked if there was anything illegal in the vehicle and asked for permission to search the vehicle. The complainant declined to search, but did provide consent for Officer 1 to return the gun to the inside of his vehicle and lock it. So this brings us to the end of the first stop, where before releasing the complainant with no arrest, Officer 3 discovered that the complainant's license was suspended and instructed him not to drive his vehicle. Officer 3 was interrupted by another officer before being able to explain why the license was suspended. The officers did not provide the complainant with paperwork that can be typical of official notice that your license has been suspended and why, or confiscate his license, which can sometimes be mailed back to the DMV so that people have cause to go get a new license. Let's see, on his way back to the bar, the complainant, this exchange was not captured on body-worn camera footage. After the complainant was released without arrest, the complainant asked officers involved in the first stop for their names and badge numbers. The complainant alleged that some of the officers ignored his request, but Officer 2 provided all names and badge numbers. Okay. After releasing the complainant without arrest, and under the instruction of his suspended license, Officer 1 did not go back to his post in Clarendon, where were aware that there are increasing levels of violent and gun-related activity. Officer 1 remained parked and nearby to watch the complainant's vehicle. When the complainant returned to his vehicle and started to drive away, Officer 1 pulled him over for driving with a suspended license. Officer 2 asked if the complainant had someone who could come and drive his vehicle or take an Uber so that the officer didn't have to take him to jail. But the complainant said his friends had already gone home and he could walk. He did ask if he could repark his car and walk, and they said no. So Officer 1 inquires about the complainant choosing to drive on a suspended license. His response isn't fully audible in the body-worn camera footage, but he seemed to be suggesting that he didn't know about his license being suspended. Officer 1 replied that if the complainant keeps lying, that they would take him to jail. The complainant asked officers why his license was suspended, and Officer 1 told the complainant that he didn't know because he didn't see the information that Officer 3 pulled up during stop 1. At that juncture, it seems like the DMV systems were down, which also sounds like it's typical and recurring on weekends, which maybe isn't the best scheduling for that. But they weren't able to get the rest of the information about that suspension. So Officer 1 tells him he can't repark his car and orders him to get out of the vehicle. Officer 4 arrives back at the traffic stop and performed a pat down on the complainant, took his driver's license to reprocess information. Officer 5 also arrives back at the vehicle to assist. Officer 1, who had been doing the questioning during the first stop, begins questioning the complainant about his firearm, where it was purchased, what information he disclosed on his permit application regarding a previous felony conviction. Officer 4 at that point comes over to Officer 1 to inform him that the complainant is showing up in a criminal database as affiliated with the Crips. The complainant states that they're not a member of a gang. And it seems like there is some information. We're not fully able to parcel out what information is attributable to the specific complainant at this point. So the officers kind of deliberate around whether or not some of this information is conflated with somebody who might have the same name and date of birth. Officer 5 is attempting to access the DMV system, but the DMV system is down. So Officer 1, needing to tow the vehicle, begins to prepare to do an inventory search. And the policy for an inventory search is in the discussion plan. But the purpose of an inventory search is to secure any valuables and identify any, what's the word? Contraband. There we go, thanks. So identifying any valuables to protect an owner's property, to protect the police department from liability against claims of lost, stolen, or vandalized property, and to protect the officer and the department against danger. And there are some kind of specifics in the policy that we'll get into in discussion. But the inventory search is meant to identify and secure those things. The underlying case law around that is from an incident where the person was not present. So there's a little bit of a distinction between the established case law and the situation where the person was there. And throughout the inventory search, the complainant tells the officers that there's nothing valuable, there's nothing else of value in their car, and that they don't consent to a search. So the Officer 4, I believe, tells the complainant about the case law that authorizes this search. And we're not able to see all of the body-worn camera footage of Officers 1 and 2 conducting the inventory search, but we did see a couple of specific activities that we'll want to talk through. One was Officer 1 searched the complainant's glove compartment where the gun had been stored. That was checked against a police database that didn't return any records. Officer 1 also searched the center console and the front seat area. Parts of this search seemed inconsistent with a search for valuables or contraband, opening up small packets of gum and looking into them, and with a flashlight and feeling around empty potato chip bags, lots of kind of checking. There was a sweep underneath the passenger vehicle, look in the back seat, and then also a search of the trunk, which again, we'll get to in the specific policies for the authorization of searching the trunk, where Officer 1 found a backpack belonging to the complainant. The complainant said there's nothing of value. Officer 1 goes through, while going through the backpack, makes a comment to Officer 2 saying, I feel like I'm missing something. And Officer 2 says, yeah, then why such a big reaction? Referring to the fact that the complainant was kind of repeatedly protesting that there was no need to search the vehicle. So the search didn't return any contraband or other evidence. There was a small quantity of marijuana and some other kind of unconfirmed pills in.
Can I make a small comment?
Yeah, please.
I just wanted to note that Officer 1 spoke extensively during his interview about how after 30 years of being a cop, he can tell through people's behavior whether they're being deceptive. And he seemed to be indicating that he felt that the complainant was being deceptive. I just think that's important context for the way they went through the car and the whole issue of why did he react that way. Remember that Officer 1 asked for permission for us to look through the car, and of course the complainant said no, and then they go and look through the car. You know, they have the right to do whatever, but one might suppose that a person's reaction has more to do with you just asked me, and but now you're going to do it anyway. But I just wanted to give that. I thought that was important context as to the state of mind of Officer 1 for sure.
Okay, thank you. So Officer 1 then, having found marijuana, asked the complainant why he lied about having drugs in his car. The complainant responds that the marijuana was not in the car, but in the trunk, where it is permitted under Virginia code, referenced here, using or consuming marijuana or marijuana products while in a motor vehicle being driven upon a public highway. At the conclusion of the interaction, Officer 5 issues the complainant a citation for driving with a suspended license, and Officer 1 fills out a form that goes to Virginia State Police that marijuana was found in the vehicle to flag him from buying more weapons. So after both stops, the complainant is released without arrest. I want to make a couple of other notes before we get into the alleged policy violations and then give Mummy and Albert a chance to weigh in. One is that since a previous meeting that we discussed Arlington County Police pointing guns at people, ACPD has implemented an informal protocol right now for data collection around how often officers do that. That was since our last investigation, but after this case was reviewed, while they put in place a more formal data collection tracking system. The other thing I wanted to note was, I forgot. So we'll go back to the policy violations and then we'll see if I remember. There are 3 alleged policy violations included in OPR's report. Personal contacts, duty responsibilities, search and seizure. Those policies are included in your kind of discussion plan for quick reference. And we'll go through that a little bit more in detail. The personal contacts for our purposes, sorry, let me pull this back up. We have now reviewed kind of, I think, enough cases that we're familiar with the personal contacts policy and the distinction as ACPD draws personal contacts being to do with more verbal activities and duty responsibilities being more to do with actions. So in our, recommendations, we were looking at a personal contacts violation for Officer 4 relating to the use of profanity, threats of violence, and derogatory terms like baby mama. For duty responsibilities, looking at Officer 1 who didn't return to their post and kind of had this prolonged detainment of somebody over some tense and maybe not fully forthcoming communication, but also then leaving a post at a busy and kind of high risk area for a minor traffic violation. And not, for to Lisa's point about, you know, being so interested in building a rapport to establish credibility, not hearing what the complainant was saying when the complainant pointed to, having a sensitivity about sharing information about criminal records that may have been expunged because it could create the perception that they were not supposed to have this concealed carry permit. Officer 4, duty responsibilities, looking at the unnecessary escalation of the initial approach. Running towards somebody decreases your distance and your time rather than increasing your distance and time. Could have issued commands from behind a vehicle and or waited for other officers to arrive for support. Used commands to demonstrate compliance without threats of violence. The search and seizure, so for search and seizure pertains to officers 1 and 2 who conducted the inventory search. Searching where the policy stipulates, so the purpose of an inventory search, as I said, is threefold: to protect an owner's property, to protect the police department against claims, and to protect the officer and department against danger. There is stipulation about closed containers. One of the, I forget, and I didn't pull it in, the Supreme Court case around the inventory search that does specify that since the officers already had the keys to the vehicle, they are allowed to search in the trunk. But there's a further stipulation here about the scope of an inventory may include a closed container when the contents of the container cannot be ascertained from examining the container's exterior. Closed containers which are locked or otherwise sealed may be opened with minimal amount of force necessary when the facts and circumstances at the time would lead an officer to believe that opening the locked or sealed container was reasonable within the purpose of the inventory. So we're looking for valuables or contraband. And then it very clear, oh, there it is. Dakota versus Opperman is the Supreme Court precedent, but the main policy stipulates that a search for evidence may not be conducted under the guise of an inventory. And so it seemed like from the comments Officer 1 made about, I feel like I'm missing something, that the thoroughness of opening up packets of gum and feeling around empty chip bags was not a sincere search for valuables or contraband, but rather a exploring kind of confirmation of suspicions that something more criminal is going on. So that's our outline for search and seizure.
Julie, can I interrupt? Isn't Officer 1 and 5 the ones that we're talking about for the inventory? And Officer 2 for the search at stop 1? Because I don't think Officer 2 was involved in the inventory search. Yes.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yes.
Yeah, 1 and 5 for the second incident, and 1 and 2 were involved. Well, there's a bunch of people involved in like the first encounter.
Right.
1 and 5.
Okay, Officer 5 is who responded to, I feel like I'm missing something too. Why are we getting such a big reaction? Right.
Right, that's Officer 5.
Thank you. And then the 2 policies not included in the ACPD OPR investigation pertaining to bias-free policing and use of force. It seems like Officer 1 is being guided by a preconceived notion that the complainant should not have this permit. And there were some comments made around like storing of the gun in a glove compartment not being something that Officer 1 liked, and Officer 1 acknowledging that that's my opinion and you're allowed to do it, but I don't really like it, versus other comments like, I feel like I'm missing something, where it did seem like the kind of exhaustive questioning was beyond the scope of the threat. And so that brings us to Officer 4. Oops, so is this. where the initial report by the bouncer was that somebody came to the bar with a gun. There was not an indication of a specific threat. There wasn't an accusation of brandishing the weapon, making threats, fighting with anyone, or like running away. And so when we're looking at the kind of initial set of circumstances that they're responding to, recognizing that ACPD has a very strong interest in pursuing and identifying and understanding what's going on with any guns in the Clarendon area, that were this to be a different demographic person, the initial approach, running up to somebody, pointing a gun at their head and saying, get on the fucking ground or I'm gonna shoot you, if you reach for a gun, I'm gonna shoot you in the fucking head. That doesn't seem like something that would have been the same approach for a white person walking in Clarendon with a concealed carry permit. The lack of de-escalation just sticks out there. And then lastly, the use of force, where we've covered this in previous conversations from a policy standpoint, obviously circumstances being considered separately. The policy about use of force stipulates that pointing a gun at somebody is a serious act, and that requires that the officer must be able to tactically justify their actions. In the interview with Officer 4, he explains that, as I said, he thought that the complainant was trying to flee law enforcement, which by Graham versus Connor is not a tactical justification for pointing a gun at someone. But also that it was weird that somebody would have a gun and not an ID amidst increased activity and gun-related violence in the Clarendon area. So those are our 3+2 policy considerations. I'll give Mummy and Albert a chance to contextualize. Lisa, please add anything else.
So I just wanted to mention, because I think it's relevant perhaps to the conclusion, and I don't want to speak for ACPD, but let us say that one assumes that what came out of the interviews of the officers would color influence ACPD's final conclusion as to whether or not somebody should be exonerated or so. I've mentioned this before, as in being interested in what sorts of training interviewers get for these types of things, because it has seemed to me at times that interviewers, perhaps unintentionally, are leading or providing the answer to the question. And I can give some examples specifically for Officer 4. Toward the end of the interview, they were asked, so why did you point a gun at this person, or why did you execute this way? Did you think they were being too slow, or did you think they took too long? That's kind of giving them the answer. It felt very much like they were saying, and here's the answer. Now, that's probably not what they meant. They may just have, but the thing is, thinking through how you ask a question, if you don't do it in an open-ended way, it can appear as the answer is very so. But forgive me, I'm sure that the interviewer was trying to get at the truth, as we're all trying to get at the truth, but it's the way that you ask the question. And so, that may have led to their conclusion that they should be exonerated on the duty responsibilities. But anyway, so there, and then also with Officer 1, there was a lot of sort of summarizing for him or providing his responses at the end in a way that didn't seem as open-ended as would have been.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No. I mean, it's something we'll keep touching on until we have a solution, but worth noting. Mummy?
Yes. There's definitely a lot to unpack in this investigation, obviously because there's multiple stops, multiple officers involved. So I'll try to be as brief as I possibly can, but I definitely want to make sure to hit on a lot of the key points that I think need to be pulled out of this discussion. The first thing, though, I wanted to do before I start was to just make a verbal correction that I'll go back and change in my report. Not the clerical one that I pointed out to you all, which regarding one of the disciplinary findings, which was correct in the narrative, but incorrect just in the chart notation. But Officer 3, in my report, I noted that Officer 3 was not interviewed, and actually Officer 3 was interviewed. I just was not present at that interview, so I didn't realize until afterwards that Officer 3, I forgot that Officer 3 had been interviewed separately. Initially, it was my recommendation that all of the officers that were involved in this incident, all 5 officers be interviewed, and that they all be interviewed as subject officers. Initially, ACPD declined to interview Officer 3, and Officer 5 was interviewed, but as a witness officer, but then later decided to interview Officer 3 as part of the investigation. Both Officers 3 and 5 were interviewed as witness officers, so my recommendation that they all should have been interviewed as subject officers remains, but I will make the correction in my report that Officer 3 was interviewed. And that's the first officer that interacts with Mr. Williams, but not the one that were, not the 2 officers that were interacting with the bouncer in terms of the sequence of events. And I think that's important for the next point, which is that Officer 3, was one of the officers who pointed a firearm at the complainant in addition to Officer 4. And so I think that in the course of this investigation, Officer 3 should have also been evaluated for that conduct. The unfortunate part is that there was no use of force allegation in this investigation, and I think that is, a continuation of the discussion that we've been having already, which is that, under current ACPD policy, pointing a firearm at someone is not per se something that's going to trigger a use of force review. It could, I guess, if there are circumstances that warrant a supervisor who's looking at an incident report to ask some questions, and then they see something that they find to be problematic, then one could be initiated, but it's not something that's automatically done. I do think that you can't really necessarily reach an analysis in this situation that there was a violation of the use of force policy. I think in these circumstances, there could have been hypothetically an articulation if this person had a weapon. And keeping in mind, just to give some narrative here. So let me just backtrack to this. I think a lot of times with incidents, particularly ones that are involving underlying alleged criminal conduct, it's really important to focus on the story and the narrative of what's happening here. So when the complainant tries to go into the bar with his concealed weapon, which he has a valid permit for, that particular action alone is not actually against the law. Why does it make sense for someone to go into a bar with a firearm and then not be able to drink in that bar? I mean, I don't know, but maybe not everybody's going into a bar is drinking, but that's the way the law is. You physically have to go in the bar and then actually have a drink to violate that section of Virginia Code, which is a misdemeanor. So he goes to the bar. He doesn't actually even make it inside. The bouncer tells him, "Hey, you can't come in here with the bar," which is, their right to do so, to not allow people to go in there. What then unfortunately happens is, and we don't know because the bouncer wasn't a part of this investigation. I would have liked to have heard from the bouncer exactly what they relayed to the officer, but they didn't know who the bouncer was. And, we were able to, at least though, in the officer interviews, glean from them what the interaction was with the bouncer. What I think kind of happens here is, I don't know if it's a miscommunication, a bad game of telephone, or what happens, or maybe just a heads up. Hey, this person, was trying to bring a gun in there because of the fact that there had been some other events in the Clarendon area related to guns, and maybe that's just their practice of, we're just going to let officers know so they can be mindful. So Officer 1 and 2 are the ones that are having this conversation with the bouncer, but it's actually Officers 3 and 4 that end up having the foremost interaction with the complainant. I I think that just, I have some questions around how that kind of unfolds, because it would seem to me from just a logistical standpoint that you'd want the officers to, who have the most amount of information, to be the ones that are, front facing with any sort of apprehension. But obviously that, tactically may not always be possible, right? Like you may have someone who's closer to that person than the other person. And so there, I think, are just different ways that scenarios play out, understandably, because of just where people are located. But I think in this particular circumstance, Officer 4, who's the last officer to arrive at stop 1, with the least amount of information, is the one who takes off running and then begins to apprehend Mr. Williams, which I think is what kind of, it may be a factor to consider in like the escalation of the use of force, because there wasn't enough time for the officers to really talk about what took place and figure out the right approach to it. The Officer 4 and Officer 3 didn't even, as far as I know, directly talk to the bouncer. So whatever information they had, and to Officer 4's, credit, we're being fair and objective here, he's getting this information from other officers. So thinking about what Officer 4 had in his mind. And Officer 2, specifically, when Officer 4 got to the scene to be kind of like briefed, and this briefing was all of a minute and maybe 30 seconds tops. So that's just not a lot of time to have all the facts and fully assess the situation. But what I found problematic was the Officer 2 said to Officer 4, see that guy across the parking lot with the red bandana? He's trying to boogie. That, I think, is a statement that should be unpacked. I have some reservations about, obviously, there's going to be some vernacular and sayings that are used in policing and in any workforce. But I think we have to think about the implications of a statement like that, especially because it seemed to incentivize Officer 4 and escalate his level of how he should apprehend the complainant, right? So he then responds well, what did he do? He tried to bring a gun in the bar. That's all he knows. And then he takes off running. That still, I think, should have warranted some more conversation, because just bringing a gun in a bar without some additional information may not always necessarily be legal, but obviously you need to actually effectuate a stop in order to figure out, does this person have a legal concealed weapons permit and that sort of thing. So going, and then, also thinking about just the fact that it's a dark area. It's, the complaint is on another side of the parking lot when they're first having this conversation. So Officer 4 arrives on the scene, is told that guy's trying to boogie, sees Officer 3 kind of walking a little hastily to try to catch up with the complainant, who was not, by any of the officers' accounts, running. He's just walking back to his car. And Officer 1 even said he appeared to not even know that we were looking at him. So, in that sense, there was enough time for them to make an assessment of his behavior, but yet Officer 2 still made the assessment that he's trying to boogie. I'm not really sure what that means, but I don't, in my professional opinion, think that could be anything good. And maybe there needs to be some more specificity around saying that, because you don't know how someone's going to interpret that statement. There could be a lot of different ways to interpret that statement, and that without other information can instigate a situation unnecessarily. Obviously, if the circumstances were that this person tried to bring the gun in the bar and was trying to point it at someone, or displayed any sort of violent behavior, or there had been an altercation, or the person was running, there are a number of factors that, would then contribute to maybe a heightened level of apprehension. So anyways, going into the use of force piece, I say all that to say, even if a use of force analysis had been done here, it's possible that there were, objectively reasonable justifications for pointing the firearm under the current policy. What I do have an issue with is Officer 4's verbal statements saying, if you reach for your gun, I'll shoot you in the fucking head. And I'm being explicit about saying the explicit language, because I think it needs to be clear how forceful that statement was. I don't think that that's personal context. I think that is a verbal threat. I think that's different than telling someone, get out of my effing way, or, something along those lines that includes profanity or is rude. But when you say to someone, I will shoot you in the effing head, that is a verbal threat. That is something that if I was a layperson saying that to someone, I could be prosecuted for. So to not address it with that level of seriousness in this investigation, I think is gravely understating what happened here. And I think it's really important to say that at the onset, because we have to keep that in mind when we think about how the complainant was responding to the officers and how he was responding to the questions, which is that his life was just threatened. And so we can't expect that he's going to answer questions in the way that we would have liked him to, or that maybe we would have. And I do think, objectively speaking, that some of the answers, were evasive, or I can understand why they would have been perceived as evasive also from the mindset of the officer. But I think, and I'll get to this conversation later, that's about, us doing a better job of humanizing these interactions, because if someone had just pointed a gun at your head and told you, I'm going to shoot you in the effing head, you have no reason to think that the person you're talking to at this point is going to be reasonable, or that your safety is not, in jeopardy. And so, it's reasonable to me that the complainant might have been factoring some of those things in and trying to do a cost-benefit analysis in his head about how much information to disclose, particularly because I think the conviction that was at issue in this matter was expunged. And then there was also an issue that I wanted to clarify about his identity during the course of the stops. It seemed that there was someone else with the exact same name and date of birth who lived in maybe Las Vegas or on the West Coast somewhere, who had some convictions coming up as well. And so part of the kind of interaction with the officers is, they're saying like, oh, you have, you're a member of the Crips, or you have this conviction, you had a DUI in Vegas. And he's like, no, that's not me. That leads to, I think, on both sides, some of the like, I'm not sure what's going on here. And then the officers are thinking that he's being evasive when actually there was some actual clerical issues. It seems that there was someone else coming up, and the officers ultimately come to that conclusion. But obviously this is after, 2 very lengthy stops. So I think I finished my point on the use of force piece. I think this definitely is something, and we made this recommendation. I'm going to continue to repeat the recommendation that pointing a firearm has to require a use of force investigation, and then that the personal contacts allegation in this investigation should have been a use of force allegation. Or maybe the policy needs to be revised so that it includes those sort of statements, so that it would in the future be a use of force allegation. For bias-free policing, that I also look at as kind of like the, I guess the substitute for duty and responsibilities. I think that all of the officers in this interaction should have also been investigated for bias-free policing. I would not go so far as to make any recommended findings, because of the fact that we simply did not ask them the questions that would have, I think, given us some indication one way or another. But I think that there were some specific actions and statements that were made during the interaction that certainly give me pause and concerns about whether there was bias impacting some of the ways in which the officers interacted with the complainant. I think that the comment about, were you trying to go inside to shoot up the club because your baby mama's inside, and that being just premised on the fact that he left his ID in his pocket, which anybody could do, leave their ID by accident in the car. But that factor, and the fact that he had a weapon on him, caused this whole line of questioning of like, you're trying to go in the bar to shoot up the club because your baby mom is inside. And I hope I don't have to really get into detail to explain why a baby mama comment has racial connotations to it, but it certainly gives me concern. I think also the constant drug references throughout the stop were concerning to me. And I also think that the statements made during, particularly from Officer 1, that he was just really fixated on the concept that this person was not someone who should have a concealed weapons permit. And that fixation, I think we should have unpacked that a little bit more and looked at all of that, the conduct under bias-free policing. Instead, we looked at duty and responsibilities instead. And I just want to blanketly say, I was very adamant about a bias-free policing allegation and the addressing of the baby mama comment in this investigation, and that did not happen. And I think that was also something that should have been done. I think that the duty responsibilities piece is kind of the sub allegation here, where we would be looking at how long the stop went, the length of the questionings that went on, the baby mama comment, the drug references, the comments about the quarters. He was asked just so many questions about You know, how does he afford his car? Where does he work? How much money does he make? Where was he born? Where did he grow up? Just a lot of questions that, you know, I think if you didn't have the context of like all of the rest of the things that are going in the stop could probably be like, you know, in certain circumstances, you know, reasonable based on whatever the stop is for. But I think in this particular situation, it was kind of a theme of, we know that this person is doing something wrong, and we are just going to ask every possible question that we can to find something. He took the breathalyzer test, that came back as he's not under the influence, but there's still this kind of really just determination to find something to arrest him for. And then ultimately after stop 1, he was not arrested. And then, you know, we go to stop 2, which I'll get to that later. I think that's where all of the factors for duty and responsibilities go in. And just to touch on where I landed with duty and responsibilities, actually, let me go back. For personal contacts, Officer 4 was the only officer who was investigated for personal contacts. I sustained that. For duty responsibilities, officers 1, let me just make sure I have it right. Officers 1, 2, and 4 were investigated, and I sustained all 3 of them. Officers 3 and 5 were not investigated for any allegations, but I would have included them in duty responsibilities because they participated in both of the stops and participated in the questioning and the kind of interactions that happened between them. So that's duty responsibilities. For search and seizure, I would have sustained Officer 1. Officer 2, I exonerated. Officer 2's search and seizure allegation was him flashing the flashlight into the complainant's vehicle from the outside of the vehicle. Just under current law, that is not a search and seizure. It's a public, street, and he didn't actually enter the vehicle. So shining the flashlight, while I understand, you know, a citizen might find that to be intrusive, especially because he was so adamant about, I don't want my vehicle searched, that just under the law is not considered a search. So I exonerated that. But Officer 5, I would have included in the allegations, and I would have sustained both Officer 1 and 5 because they both participated in the inventory search of the complainant's vehicle. As it pertains to the search and seizure, I think that you covered that really well, Julie, in outlining the issues with, in my professional opinion, I just don't see how this can be an inventory search when you are flashing a light into a pack of chewing gum or, you know, touching a bag of chips and looking for things. It just went far beyond that. For the backpack, I do think that it is reasonable for an officer to at least open it and see what's inside, you know, just at least some sort of like, you know, perfunctory search. You need to go through every nook and cranny of it, probably not. But it wouldn't make sense for me for an officer to grab the backpack out of the trunk and just hand it back to someone not knowing what's inside, because then you don't know if they might be compromising their safety or other people's safety. And I think that makes sense, but I think that the level at which they went through the backpack and the rest of the items in the trunk, even lifting the bed of the trunk, is where I took issue. So I just wanted to clarify that I don't necessarily agree. I think the complainant's position was that he just felt like the backpack should have just been handed to him. I don't think that is a safe practice. And we want these officers to be safe, and we want the people around them to be safe when they're doing this. But the law is very clear that inventory searches cannot be performed, or criminal searches cannot be performed under the guise of an inventory search. And I think that's exactly what we had here. And that's why I would have sustained on both of those. I talked about the theme of the kind of human interactions and the determination to criminalize. I think we should always be kind of, you know, mindful of that because it leads to over policing. I think that there's just this fine balance of, you know, officers obviously are trained differently than lay people, right? And there may be certain things, factors that they pick up on that the layperson would not pick up on as factors that may lead to how they're assessing, you know, threat level or what's going on in a situation. When you've had someone outside for 45 minutes to an hour and you can't find anything and it just continues to go on and on and on and on, there has to be a point at which you say, okay, well, you know, maybe we got off on the wrong foot, maybe there's some misunderstandings going on here, but like we need to call it at this point. And that just didn't happen. And I also wanted to say that I thought that it was very, it was concerning to me that Officer 1 left his Clarendon detail and waited outside for 30 minutes for the complainant to come back to his vehicle because he suspected he was going to come back and drive on the suspended license, which, you know, as you all said, he was told that his license was suspended, but he wasn't told why it was suspended. And there's also, you know, it's possible that he said during his interview that it wasn't explained to him, and he might have thought that that was also a clerical error because of all the other miscommunications that were going on. But it wasn't explained to him, you know, for just very innocent reasons, right? Like the person was about to explain it and then got interrupted or what have you, but just thinking about the mindset. But let's just say, you know, this person's driving on a suspended license. When we're talking about like resource allocation, if we're saying that this Clarendon area this time of night is like very dangerous and perhaps the most dangerous part of Arlington and requires all these additional details and resources, do we want an officer to be leaving that area to go and sit in a car for 30 minutes and literally wait for someone to come back and pull off the vehicle just to prove to yourself that this is someone who should not have a concealed weapons permit? I think personally, not personally, I think professionally, that is taking it a little bit to the, I think that's a conversation about resources, and I think that is taking it to the place of kind of over policing something that, you know, when you think about the cost benefit analysis, it's not worth it. And then the last thing I will say is that I too have, I put some concerns and recommendations around the nature of the questionings during the interviews. That's been a consistent concern of mine throughout almost all of the investigations, that there needs to be some more open-ended questions instead of saying things like, you know, the reason why you did X, Y, and Z was because of so-and-so. And then the officer says, yes, they should say, tell me why you did X, Y, and Z, so they can hear it from the officer's mouth verbatim. And I think that kind of also just leads to my last point too about these allegations, right? Like, I understand too, right? Investigating and especially sustaining an officer on bias-free policing is not like something, it's not fun for anyone, right? Like, you don't want anyone to be labeled, especially because a lot of times the biases that we are potentially acting on are ones that we're not even conscious of. And so I think that, bless you, there should be a conversation about like what the ramifications of that is, but that should not be a deterrence to us actually calling it what it is and investigating and asking the right questions. Because if what we're doing here is trying to not label something a certain way or not ask certain questions to not get information out that may seem to be, you know, detrimental to the officer. Obviously, I'm not saying that, you know, under any sort of guise that these allegations obviously have disciplinary implications, right? And so, you know, I think depending on the circumstances, I certainly would, I think that it would be fruitful for us to have a conversation about whether all of these types of circumstances even warrant discipline, and maybe there should be like a category of certain types of things that are really just training and not discipline, so that we're not scared to have these conversations because we're thinking about what the implications might be. And I understand that, but I think that then doesn't allow us to actually get to the heart of some of these issues and really unpack what's going on here, which will then foster, you know, better communication, better interactions with the community and members of the police department, and will understand what's, you know, causing some of these escalations or, you know, these situations to turn out in ways that I don't think anybody at this table, you know, wanted this interaction to happen this way. But what's more important to me is like the why behind it versus the result of what happens. But I know that I'm saying that not being the person on the receiving end of whatever that discipline or that allegation or that label may be. And so in any way that I can advocate that should not be the, you know, it shouldn't be so punitive, but it should be more of an opportunity for people to learn and be provided better resources and skills to understand and identify and educate around some of these biases, then I would fully support that. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. I do want to say, I know the opening, keeping track of all of this, it's a lot of officer numbers. So when we get into discussion after Albert, we'll go one kind of officer in violation at a time so we can consider the relevant facts. But we do, recognizing that everyone has read the reports and seen a lot of the footage, we did kind of want to cover that. The only thing I wanted to add, Mummy, to what you were saying about, you know, kind of the story of this is in the absence of a specific threat, right, from the initial bouncers notifying ACPD that there was a gun in Clarendon, you know, a specific threat of using the gun or something that, right, like this guy's walking in a dark street by himself, not towards another crowd, not, you know, running away, the fear of fleeing. My challenge is that then because of the way they're approached and then their posture when they're in handcuffs between their vehicle and another parked vehicle and between two officers to kind of contain movement, which makes sense if you're detaining someone to want to like make sure, but the proximity to somebody who's just pointed a gun at your head and said, I'm going to shoot you in the fucking head if you know, reach for a gun, that in that conversation that Lisa points to about like, we're trying, you know, Officer One makes a lot of effort to establish a more friendly rapport in his language saying, you know, I just want you to understand, we're worried about another gun. We need to know that you're a good guy, you know, but the follow through of that conversation, the like listening for understanding, that my challenge in this preconceived notion is that he's not hearing the information that's dissuading the conclusion that he seems to be looking for when he says, I didn't have a driver's license, I've never been to Vegas. You know, this kind of insistence, like that narrative seemed very credible to me, that like you could hear after he explained that he'd served 6 months in jail, but that was, I mean, almost 20 years ago. He'd never had any of these other things, that link didn't get closed. So that was,
Can I get on to that?
yeah, that was the challenge I had.
Just to quickly, I think the issue, and we talked about this with Officer One, is his confidence that he can tell from people's behavior if they're lying. And that led him to conclusions where perhaps he wasn't hearing or wasn't taking in the information the same way because of his confidence in his ability to tell if people are lying. And I think it's very important that we empower our officers to rely on their
Gut.
feelings or understand. I don't want to say feelings. Their best judgment. We want them to rely on their best judgment, but it's important that they have the right training and information to help them do that. And there's a pretty deep body of evidence that you cannot tell if someone is lying from their behavior. And that you can tell from verbal cues, but you have to be trained to elicit those verbal cues. So the only reason I come back to this is because, you know, we want our officers to have the best information, the best training, and you need to be trained to be able to really tell if people are lying, and it's concerning or it could lead to erroneous conclusions if you have a sense that you can tell from behavior when the evidence is that you really can't generally tell from behavior. That's the only reason.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you. Albert?
Yeah, so thank you. And thank you for this. As everyone heard, this is actually a multi-tiered event involving a lot of officers, multiple scenes, and I appreciate everyone looking through it. And I'll start with this statement, which is I always try to focus on where are the areas of common ground. And there are areas. Despite the sort of differences in our two reports, I'm listening to you, I'm taking notes intently, and I'm happy to hear that you're recognizing some of these things that are happening here that are very dangerous for officers, right? We have an individual who is determined, you know, at the end of the incident that they actually did have a gun on their person. It was removed from them after they were detained and stopped. So that is actually, a heightened level of, I guess, danger for the officers that are involved. And I appreciate the awareness that there is a public safety interest for ACPD to investigate individuals who are attempting to carry guns into places that serve alcohol late at night. I just don't think that concealed guns and alcohol mix, those two things should probably be separated at all times. So I appreciate that, and I'll start with that statement, and I'll sort of go through some of the things that you all talked about and hopefully provide some clarifying things that maybe you were not aware of before, because as I'm listening to them, I'm like, oh, okay, I think there might be a clarification error. And then at the end of the day, it's the facts are laid out as they are, if that makes sense. And so let me go through the first sort of thing, which is the use of force. And we've talked about this. This is probably the third time now that we've talked about pointing a firearm and whether or not that should or should not be included in the current use of force policy as ACPD sees it. And we've made some adjustments, or in the process, I think you said we did make the adjustments. We are definitely, we're working through the technical piece, but those adjustments have already been approved. We're just waiting for that little technical piece to sort of iron itself out. And so I'll say that the policy is as it is now, and we're making adjustments to track things. And for this particular incident, and I'm glad you recognize this, is that regardless of whether or not a use of force incident, a specific use of force review was done in this incident, what I will say is that it is done, okay? So OPR looks at the incident. It's not something that we just negate. We are trying to look at all policies, the entire manual, and determine whether or not the entire incident is within all of our policies, right? Did they turn their camera on? Did they do this? Did they park their car correctly? There's a whole were they wearing the correct uniform? Those are all the things when we look at an incident that we intake. So for us to say that we did not look at this from a use of force perspective, especially when there's guns that are drawn, that's just, I get that the official review wasn't done, but when we look at the incident, we take in and ingest whether or not the incident was done within all policies of ACPD, because we have to. We have that obligation to do that for everything that covers under the manual. We want our officers to follow the policy. And then before I go on, I just want to recognize that the chief, and we have some deputy chiefs here. If you all have something to chime in, then.
No, I mean, I can hit it. The first thing that we've worked on is modifying our reporting system to track instances shooting guns with bullets. So there's some technical stuff that's got to happen there. And then we're reaching out to get some other policies, model policies about the follow-up past that. But the first step, the technical piece we're working on is just technical. So I can't even explain.
We're really close. I assure you, we're really, really close. But when we deal with these things, a little bit changes and switching this, we have to make sure it doesn't impact other things in our reporting system. And that's why it's just taking a little bit of time. We want to be careful that we're not accidentally turning other things off when we turn this on. And so that's why we want to make sure that we get this right.
Can I ask you about that?
Yeah.
In your existing policy, it does say that when a firearm is pointed, that there has to be some notation of it somewhere, I think.
Yeah, it has to be in a case report. It has to be in a
Right.
case report or a case supplement.
So can you explain just not what the technical piece is, but what it is that you want to track? Because
We want to track exactly what officer has pointed a firearm. And we want to be able to pull that, because I think in our first discussion several meetings ago, you were like, can this be done? And the short answer is yes, I can do it. Will it take me a long time to do? Yes, because I have to digest this data within the body of narratives to determine whether or not a firearm was pointed. So, there's no notation right now. So once I turn this trigger on, or once we turn this trigger on, I will be able to simply run a very quick report. Let me know what officer pointed their firearm and what the associated case number is. So I can start running data analytics on a lot of things.
will it be like a new box or something, or is it just like?
It will, so,
search or-
I mean, I don't want to get too, I don't know how interested you are in
It's
getting
not
too
a new
technical.
box.
Yeah,
We bought it off the shelf. Our last CAD system and records management system was so modified, it eventually became unrepairable, unsustainable.
Right.
So this time we bought one, we are trying not to repeat that situation. So there are some boxes that we'll have to like take a box and repurpose it. So that's the piece we're trying to do because their systems are incredibly expensive. So we don't want to get into the official modifications of them. So we're trying to find a way to make it work. And it will, we just have to find the box to repurpose.
Okay.
Yeah, that's, when I take that box, is it going to do something that I'm just not privy of? And so I need people to be like, are you sure if I take this box, it's not gonna mess something up that we're already tracking or that we need to continue tracking? And we're running out of boxes. So, I mean, we just wanna be super careful about this. And it needs to happen, and we're gonna do it. So, the next thing that was mentioned, I think we've also had this discussion before, which is like personal contacts versus something more serious. And I think when we get into this other discussion, there are many reasons why OPR chose to use personal contacts as the allegation. Could it have been conduct unbecoming, which is what we talked about in a previous investigation, that when you say something that is so egregious that it might rise to the level of conduct unbecoming? Yes. Is it certainly within the realm of personal contacts? The answer is yes, clearly it is. I think we all recognize that. I think you all recognize that, Mummy recognizes that, and I recognize that. But why did we do this? And I think that leads to the question of, if we look at what the document that you were provided earlier with a progressive corrective action guideline, and we see that maybe the reason that we did something was to ensure that we kept what we were observing as a pattern and not deviate from that pattern. It's important for us to continue that pattern so we can implement corrective measures. I'm trying to be very careful about what I'm saying without divulging too much. But basically I'm saying we're trying to keep with a pattern that we already recognize, and it's important that we stuck with that. And that was the most beneficial way that we could deal with this incident. And I know it may sound crazy, but you all were provided documents that show that there are reasons why we did this, and it wasn't just a willy-nilly decision. This was done very intentionally. We all had a lengthy discussion about what we could do, because clearly we could have done a different one, but we intentionally chose this specific allegation because of it met the standard. It was clearly a violation, and it was important for us to basically keep to that stuff. If that's what I'm trying to say it without saying it, so.
If you could just put a pin in that real quick, because I recognized a pattern in the pattern that's being discussed, and I had questions about that pattern.
Yeah.
However, I'm uncertain to the extent that we can discuss that, because there's but so many people that could elicit that pattern in the various type of unique roles some officers may have. And I have questions about that pattern and certain unique roles that some officers might have. And I'm not sure to what extent we can discuss.
We can talk about them broadly. How about that?
Okay.
Let's talk about broad things
Okay.
and not specific things. And
Okay.
that's what I'm trying to do right now. And I appreciate you.
Well, let's separate out the
Engage in this
discipline conversation.
Right, because
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
part
Yeah,
of
yeah.
the conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we can set some kind of, ground rules around
But-
that
Yeah.
discussion before we get.
Put a
Right,
pin in.
so yeah, so
I
a pin in
gotcha.
that one, but at some
gotcha.
point, I do
Yeah.
want to address that, because I do just have some questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
So let's talk about sort of this, I think you brought up, before I get into the bi-street policing, you brought up this, I think you recognized that the complainant was being evasive during the incident one, right? And what I mean by evasive, and I get that there were reasons for that, but the officers don't know those reasons. We have now discovered this after the fact, but they're trying to figure out how it's possible that an individual who is committed serious crimes is issued a concealed carry permit. Those two things in the law enforcement world should not mix together, ever. And so they're trying to figure out how this is possible. And I think when I talked about it with some of the COB members is, I had to look this up myself because I didn't even think that it was possible, but clearly it is possible. And I didn't know all the rules surrounding because it's such a rarity. It's not something that the officers deal with every day. So they're trying to figure it out. And they ask very specific questions to determine whether or not an individual has a right to carry a gun. Have you ever been arrested before? And if so, what is the crime? To determine whether or not they're legally permitted to carry a firearm. And when you are, deceptive about that with reason, I understand that he provided some reasons, but when you become deceptive about that, the officers begin to question whether or not you are a truthful person and the veracity of all future statements. That's the problem. It's like, the first impression is the most important. And I just don't think that there was a good first impression that was provided by the complainant. It just wasn't. He was being very deceptive there. And that's what ends up prolonging the stop, because now the officers are like, well, this person is deceptive. What else is he deceptive about, et cetera, et cetera. And so I wanted to just touch on that real quick. I'll get back to that because that was brought up again. Let's talk about bias-free policing and why that particular allegation was not attached to this specific incident. So the investigator, the OPR investigator, called the complainant and spoke to the complainant for 40 minutes on the phone, did a 40-minute intense interview, asked him a series of questions. What happened? Then what happened? Then what happened? Then what happened? So he goes through this 40-minute questioning of trying to make sure that the investigator captures all of the details of this incident. Then at the end of the interview, the investigator says, what else haven't I asked? Is there anything else I need to know? He is opening the door to say, tell me, I don't know. I wasn't there. You tell me what else I'm missing here. You've made these allegations. They've been very poignant. They've been very strong. They've been very specific. Tell me what else I need to know. And the complainant never alleges that he was stopped because of his race or because of something else, or he felt that the officers were racist against him, or et cetera, which has happened in the past. And when it has happened in the past, we've always initiated and launched a bias-free policing. Now, when we review the incident, there was nothing within that incident that drew our attention or that we classified as a potential allegation of bias-free policing. That is the way that we observed it. If we observed anything differently or felt differently, just as I talked about, if someone wasn't wearing their uniform properly, we would have initiated and provided another allegation to the officer and said, hey, now we're going to talk to you about this specific allegation because we're required to do so. Here's what you're also being investigated for. But remember, that 40-minute interview takes place with the complainant, and at no time does he allege that he feels that he was, that this was done because of his race or anything like that. So we have to take him at his fact. And it wasn't like it was a short interview. It was a lengthy interview to make sure that we understood all the substantive facts about this incident. All right. So duty and responsibility. I think this has been talked about, and I don't want to come down too much, but we've talked about this in previous investigations, which is duty and responsibility is the mechanics of what happened. Like how the sequencing, right? Like, did they do their duty? If they had a duty to take a report, did they do their duty? If they had a duty to make a traffic stop, did they do their duty, et cetera? That is what we consider to be duty and responsibility. And what I say with this is, I and OPR and the agency agrees with, I'm sure all of you, the language that came out of the officer's mouth at the time of the stop was not professional. It was not okay. Are we okay with someone stopping an individual who they've been told is armed with a gun with their firearm pointed at? The answer is yes. There is an objective reason, if I think that someone is armed with a gun, that I need to pull my firearm out. Okay, and so we've talked about this at length, okay, and about why we need our officers to protect themselves to an individual they've been told has a firearm. It's not like he may have a firearm. They were told he's got a gun on him, okay? And so we need our officers to make sure that they go home safe every night. And so, I do want to point out one small thing, which is I think, and we don't have to have a lengthy discussion about this, there is a little bit of confusion about what under the influence means. And I think that is being confused with what the standard is for driving. Okay, driving in the Commonwealth of Virginia has a specific under the influence standard. That is not the standard for all other crimes that use the term under the influence. That's Virginia case law. Okay, that was established in 1954, still upheld multiple times in the Moore versus Commonwealth, Thurston versus Commonwealth. That is not the standard. It is not a BAC level. Okay, in 1954, I don't know what the legal limit was. Maybe they didn't have a legal limit.
What was
But
the second?
Thurston
Thurston.
versus Commonwealth. It is whether or not the individual appears to be under the influence. I actually have the case law here. I can read you what the definition of the case law says. And again, it's been upheld many times. So it's not 08. It's not 08. It is whether or not that individual appears to be under the influence, or by mere appearance, if they look like they've been drinking, or if someone can tell that they've been drinking. And in this case, we heard those statements that they smell like alcohol. Okay, so that is being under the influence. If you smell like alcohol under the current case law definition, that qualifies. It's not a BAC limit. That is attached to driving only. That's the only place that BAC is attached to. That's why we have machines that do that. If you are stopped for driving under the influence, that's where that BAC is attached. Let's talk about search and seizure very quickly. Okay, search and seizure. I think you recognize that, you know, there is a lot of case law. I was wondering where you got that Dakota v. Opperman case from. That was stated by the officer. So I understand that now it's coming to me. As I watched the interview, I recognize that that's what the officer said. There's been many other case laws since then. I mean, that's an older case. There's been several cases since then that basically have not done anything other than to reaffirm what Opperman says, which is that a police officer can, in conducting an inventory, search the trunk and containers within. And you're like, well, why did they go into this potato chip bag and like other bags that are in the glove and in this center console? Okay, so if you watch the video, you will see that Officer 1 pulls out cash from the center console. Okay, so we know that there are valuables inside the center console. That is where the gun was stored, but that is where the cash is, right? He pulls out the money, there's cash laying around. So now we need to check to make sure all those other things do not have cash stuffed inside them. Why do we look under floor mats? Cash is very thin. There's already cash inside the car. Maybe someone stuck it underneath the floor mat. There are many, many reasons why we've already mentioned why a thorough inventory has to be done for the vehicle. All containers within. If we let that car go and there is a claim that there was jewelry or money or cash somewhere that we did not search, that is going to be very problematic for us. And the courts recognize that. They say that, yes, in order to protect the property's owner's rights and protect the police department from liability, you have to do an administrative inventory of the vehicle prior to towing it. Lastly, it's contraband. Okay, so we talked about that. Contraband. What is contraband? Contraband is something that can be dangerous to an individual, dangerous to the tow driver, dangerous to an officer. Contraband can be something like, you know, fentanyl. That is a drug that upon touching will cause an immediate reaction and basically potential death unless you receive Narcan quickly. Okay, so fentanyl happens to be a game changer for us inside of vehicles and how dangerous it is because it can be absorbed through the skin. Okay, do we want tow drivers to touch fentanyl or a vial that they're unaware of and then perhaps be absorbed through their skin and cause them problems? The answer is no. So without getting too much into detail, the inventory was done pursuant to our policy, pursuant to case law, and pursuant to things that we've already discussed here. And I'm kind of sort of giving you the reasons as to why this took place. So we talked about the prolonging of the stop. So let me go to this point, and hopefully it's a clarification point. And it's, you know, we talked about Officer 1 not being in the area of Clarendon if this was such a high priority thing. So The Clarendon duties and responsibility sheet clearly state, and I have it here, okay, that once the bars close, that officers are to go outside of the bar area to make sure that people are not urinating in public, doing noise complaints, getting into fights, and doing everything bad that has traditionally happened once the bars close. They go into the neighborhoods and they do all those things, and this has become a community issue. They are directed specifically to move outside of the Clarendon area upon closing of the bar. And that's where sort of this is. And it's not super far outside the bar. We're talking about a block or half a block down. It's near where the bank is, where the I think it's a Wells Fargo bank there at Washington Boulevard and Highland Street. That just happens to be an area where the officers can muster sometimes before the event takes place, because it's so close to Clarendon and you still have a view of Clarendon. And people like to travel through there in that darkened area and do all the things, the public nuisance crimes that I just mentioned before. That is a duty and responsibility of someone that is assigned to the Clarendon detail. I just wanted to make that clarification statement. And then the last piece is, this has been mentioned several times before in this investigation, and I think I will speak on behalf of the office, is we are trying to sort of balance the need to conduct this investigation in a fair and objective way, which we always do, but also understand that it is being viewed by people who may not have the expertise and experience as a seasoned law enforcement officer. Have we completely figured it out yet? The answer is no. We're trying to figure this out. We understand that there's an audience for these interviews, and we're trying to make sure that everything is being explained satisfactorily. And that is a way of us trying to balance that. And I want to also point out, because I think I pointed this out last time, which is administrative interviews are just conducted differently than criminal interviews. Okay, they just are. The way that we conduct administrative interviews is different. I will find you all some literature about this, and so maybe this will ease some of the angst on this, but that is just the fact of the matter. It is, administrative interviews are done differently than criminal interviews. So maybe what you're used to seeing on, like, I don't know, maybe like a crime show or something like that, that is just not how an administrative interview is going to be conducted. It's just not. That's just not how it's done nationally. That's not how, but I will find you all some literature to make sure that everyone is on the same page and understands that. And then with that, I'm just going to now open it up to the chief and deputy chief if they have anything that they want to add.
I think one of the things where you talk about the administrative interviews, I think the big thing is this is not a gotcha moment. When we have something or know something, we tell you what we know. So it's not a trickery or anything like that. If you know, hey, you had on blue socks, I'm gonna say, you had on blue socks, what kind of shoes did you have on? It's not a gotcha moment.
Can I just, and I get that, and I look forward to learning more about how the interviews are done, because I'm very interested. But I'm just gonna go back to Officer 4, at the end of the interview, where he's asking him, why did you, execute this the way? Is it because the person didn't comply quickly enough? And you can see the wheels turning in the guy's head. And he goes, yeah, he wasn't fast enough. So they may not mean it that way. They may want to just be summarizing what they think is happening, but there's a balance where I think.
Balance.
But if it's for the purpose of people viewing this after the fact, you can ask a question that's open-ended, get an answer, and then say, when you say blank, do you mean that, right, for the clarification of something that the officer might say that's not familiar to a layperson who doesn't have specific law enforcement. Like the leading question avoiding leading questions can still have an opportunity for follow-up clarification without needing to, as you're saying, like suggest the answer in the question.
Yeah.
Especially because in that instance, the body-worn camera footage, like same as before, it's dark, but you can see hands in the air. Like I can see it. And I know I'm watching it in a slowed down view, but through that initial command sequence, there's not a, I didn't comply immediately. There's not a, and then kept walking and I had to, you know, like it's very reactive to the initial command. So
I tend to agree with you. So, and a lot of hats, all of us, a lot of hats around the table. So, you know, having had to do investigations of different types, I can understand the difference between administrative and criminal, but in large part tone tenor. Whereas the nature of fact finding, this is all fact finding still has some core elements to why we prefer open-ended questions, so that we're not feeding what we want to hear, you know, and so to that extent, I do think that it's not that we're caught up on must-see TV and what we think something should happen, but I think that we're objectively just saying, just in finding facts, we don't want to create a loop where we're feeding the narrative we want to hear or we think or we're presupposing. I think that's what we're trying to get at. So I look forward to delving into this, continuing to see what we can do to arrive at interviews where we're able to kind of get to these facts, but maybe not in a manner where it appears that we may be unintentionally feeding what we want to hear.
yeah. Bobby?
Sorry, just real quick, I have a request, 2 clarifications, and then a question.
Yeah.
The request is, I heard you all, Captain Kim and Chief Penn, and Captain Kim and I have had some conversations about changing the use of force policy, and also the data collection conversation about the pointing of firearms. I'm not sure how far along the department is in that process. And I also wanted to just, this is maybe a question too. I know that we discussed in the past some additional technology to where the body worn camera automatically comes on when a firearm is unholstered. Has that been launched?
Yeah, we've had that for several months.
Okay, great. I know that we talked about it in the beginning and it
It's been
hadn't been launched. But
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I just wanted to point that out as like, that's one already automatic feature that we now have that can at least track the number of times that a firearm is unholstered. Doesn't quite give us without, you know, from just a data perspective, doesn't quite tell us then what happens with it, but you have to go back and watch the footage. Obviously, we have to create mechanisms to then know what happens with the firearm and then like what the underlying circumstances were and collect that data.
Yeah.
But at least you can know now how many times physically.
But
It's-
that also captures, you're right, I mean, I think it's great technology, but I know when they were installing them, there's something you have to do to keep it from setting everything
yes.
else off, and if you don't do that,
Other
it's an
people's,
incredibly
like-
powerful tool, and it's not just my body camera it sets off. It's
People in
anybody
your
in a certain
vicinity, yeah.
range,
We talked
different
about that.
levels of the building, and cars all turn on, so.
Right.
You know, it does, you know, that, I think what it will do in the long run is hopefully it will make sure that if there's a scenario where an officer has to use their firearm, that should be, we're hoping and
Right.
make sure there's video. I still think it's important to have a records management system way
For sure, yeah.
to track, because this is gonna track accidents. I take my gun out and I forget to do what I'm
For
supposed to
sure.
do, it sets it off. So I think both A and B are a good combination.
Sure, yes, I agree with that 100%.
Well-
I'm sure it's not foolproof, but it at least gives you some data
You're
points
right.
to stand off
It
to start with. And then I would hope also that if you have all of these cameras coming on at the same time, that there's some way to indicate that it's from the same, you know, trigger. I would hope that the technology
We
is
can
there, but
we can track a
maybe-
trigger.
Yeah,
But again, it's like what the chief said, this is a newer
Right,
thing
you're
for
gonna have
us.
to-
And so I've had it for a while and I probably once a week will accidentally. Now the road guys, they're getting a little bit more used to it. But you know, guys like me that don't put on the uniform that often.
so
like,
while it may not be, okay,
I just wanted to add one context note, since this calls to a previous meeting conversation that we had, where our expressed interest is, I'm gonna say more than half motivated by preventable loss of life,
Mhm.
but the other piece of it being that we recognize as a trend or as an unchecked, you know, instinct, and we talked about this before, like, if the first tool I have in my head is a gun, to keep my safety, then I may over rely on that. And everyone agrees that we don't want to do that because we also, beyond preventable loss of life, don't want officers to be in a situation where they've made a fatal mistake because of an over reliance on a tool that's not appropriate for every situation. So that was, I mean, I know it will be a lot of work, but I think that the importance of this issue is so multifold that, you know, we'll figure it out. And that's also why I wanted to bring it up, that as a result of a previous conversation, ACPD has taken this, you know, into account and is already acting on creating policy. So I'm good at that. Mummy, I want to go back to you, and then I do want to work back.
Okay.
Sorry.
So just to finish out that point, I know that the department is in the stages of revising the use of force policy and the data collection around firearm pointing. I'm pretty comfortable speaking for the COB and myself. We would very much, I'm making a formal request to make sure that we're involved in that process and are able to collaborate with you all and give feedback. And I'm not saying
For
that
the
was
use
not
of force? Oh, yeah, I think that's a requirement.
It is by ordinance.
Yeah.
The
So,
data
yeah,
collection, I
yeah.
don't think is specifically mentioned by ordinance.
Well,
but
we're
I
gonna
would
do
certainly,
that, yeah.
I would
momentarily.
certainly encourage that
Yeah.
collaboration as well. And again, I'm not saying that you all weren't intending to, but I just want to make sure that I formally requested that. The 2 points of clarification, I think you said that personal context, that we all thought that it could fit within the personal context of the statement that Officer 4 made. I just want to be clear that it is not my position professionally, that I do not think that this was a personal context allegation, but I just want to clarify that. And then as it pertains to Officer 1 leaving the Clarendon detail, I specifically heard him say in his interview that he left his detail early to go and sit in the car, and that's why I made that statement. I wasn't insinuating, or I don't think that it was, I think his statement was insinuating that it wasn't a part of like the normal course of, like he went out of his way to leave early is what he said, that he didn't finish closing up some of the bars. And that's why I had a problem with him leaving early to go sit in the car. But certainly it makes sense that after the bars are closed, that you would then want to make sure people get to their cars safely. There's fights that could happen on the way out of the bars and that sort of thing. And that makes sense for officer presence. What I wanted to just specify was the issue was that he said himself that he left early to go do that. And then the last thing was just a question, and maybe this could be a part of the discussion, but I was wondering, with the allegation that someone tried to bring a gun into the bar, and then there needing to be a detainment, obviously, for them to figure out like what are the circumstances under which this person brought the gun into the car. Officer 1, to his credit, his first statement when he walks up to him is, "Do you have a valid concealed weapons permit?" Because he knows that it is actually, there's a lot of people carrying valid legal firearms. Wherever we land on gun, control laws, it's a different thing. But the fact of the matter is people have them, and, whether or not we think they should be carrying them into guns, it is actually, into bars rather, it is legal for them to do. So I think it made perfect sense for Officer 1 to start with that question. And I think that was a very responsible question to ask. My question is, once he's like, he literally has it on his lanyard, and he's like, here it is. He doesn't have the license on him, and he tells them where to get it from. But was there a way for them to validate the concealed weapons permit and verify it's that he's like the legal owner and that it's a valid permit, just the status of it is legal, without them having to do this extensive questioning around his criminal history? I think that's one of the pieces that kind of doesn't sit well with people sometimes, which is that if this was someone else, would he have just seen his permit, checked the ID, made sure that things checked out, it was still valid, and been like, put it in the car and sent him on his way? But it was at the very onset that they immediately started asking him, like, have you ever been to jail? Have you ever done this? Have you ever done that? And that's how these questions start, coming out, and then the answers that become like elusive. So anyways, I'm rambling, but I just wonder, like, is there a different way to have validated that without having to have gone through his entire criminal history, including things that happened when he was a kid?
The answer is yes. You can look at a criminal history. Remember, he did not have his ID on him, so all we're looking at, so I don't know if anyone here has a concealed carry permit, but it is a card, like a business card with a name, like the court, the clerk, whatever court that you got it in. I think your date of birth is on there, but that's it. There's no picture, there's no nothing. It's literally your name and the court that issued the permit. That's it. And so that's why you're required to carry an ID on you. And so, yes, I get that he's trying to like do the right thing and carry it around his neck or whatever. He doesn't have the ID, so we gotta check and make sure, hey, because I can print out the card too and make it look like it's a concealed carry permit. We gotta get the ID, we run it, but then as we're trying to get the ID, remember, these questions about your criminal history are linked to whether or not you have the ability to own a firearm, or sorry, carry a firearm or not. So this is a short answer of me saying, yes, if all of your stuff is with you, no, if your stuff is not with you. And so, and what I mean by stuff is your ID. And so those two things have to be married up together in order for us. But here's the other thing, and call me crazy for what it will, and however it came out, I don't actually remember how it came out, but you know, if there's a belief that an individual has committed a crime that would exclude them from getting this permit, there is a potential, at least in the officer's mind, to say someone has made a mistake. Someone has issued a permit that they should not have issued a permit. And I don't want to get into the mind of the officers or whatever, but clearly as I'm watching this, I would be thinking the same thing, because as I mentioned before, it's such a rarity that I had to look up the rules on it, because I've actually never dealt with this in my 23-year career here, about someone who has had this stuff happen, like, and got arrested for this, and now has a permit to carry in Virginia. It's just not something that we commonly see. So I myself would begin to question whether or not an error has been made by the court, by someone checking this person's, criminal history, something like that, which I'm not saying I don't know if it's ever happened before, but I would begin to question the validity of that. And so this is a long way of me saying, yes, there is a way. It shows up whether or not the person has, but that has to be verified whether or not with their picture ID. So
I think the point, just to clarify what you're saying, when you enter the person's name and run them, all concealed weapons permits are entered into VSEN. So that's where you can bring validity to the little paper card in the computer.
And then the presumption is, though, that it's in the computer, that the powers that be did their role correctly, correct? The presumption is the court looked at all paperwork.
Yeah, that is the presumption.
Correct.
And I don't remember the sequence of whether or not the questions about being arrested came first or after. I actually don't remember the sequence. And the funny thing is, I just watched this video before I came to me. I just don't remember the sequence of the questions. But the question is, if that question already comes out and then there's some belief that is not true, then you are going to start to question what you see on a computer, which I have done myself. Because there have been mistakes with DMV. I'm not saying that but I've clearly seen mistakes in DMV when people have not been licensed, but they actually have a license. It shows up suspended, but they're like, no, I do have a license. So those errors can happen in a person's favor too, and sometimes do, because I've witnessed that myself.
So I want to come back out to two different aspects of those conversations. That part of it is, the credibility of the complainant in the initial conversations with the police, but that the notion that the truthfulness of those responses affects the credibility of all future statements cuts both ways. And that's where we have a little bit of a challenge in this situation, is that he's hearing information that's full of errors also. And so when he walks away, absent a specific understanding of, he wasn't aware that his driver's license was suspended, he wasn't given a reason why, and he's given a cross-section of information that both is relevant to him, but seems maybe inaccurate because his records are supposed to be expunged. Other information that's being attributed to him that he truly believes is not him, having not been to Vegas, having not had a driver's license, having not been pulled over for anything related to driving in that time period, and then walking away, being released without arrest. It doesn't seem that odd to me that he chooses to get in his car and drive it home. Under the legal limit for drinking, I get that. And I think that in assessing his ability to be truthful in the first 5 minutes or 10 minutes after being, forced to the ground at gunpoint under violent and profane threat, standing right next to the person who just made me afraid for my life when I didn't brandish my weapon, I didn't threaten anyone. I wasn't acting erratically. I'm walking back to my car. I have a difficulty with this skepticism about him trying to go into the bar, because I think anyone who's been to Clarendon knows whatever age you are, you're not getting in that door without an ID. So I don't believe that he forgot that he had his gun on him, but I believe he didn't know he had his ID, and that he's walking back to, I mean, he's going towards his car. You know, this kind of part of the story checks out. And so then I land on the bias-free policing and the duty responsibilities. You say the officer has a responsibility to do everything they can to protect themselves, and that we were reviewing use of force, you know, against all policies. I don't know how running at someone who has a gun, who's not facing you, who's not coming towards you, who's been given no specific description of a threat except having a gun. I don't know how running at that person screaming is de-escalating and protecting myself versus taking a position behind something, issuing commands, demonstrating compliance. Like the running at someone, especially given the language, it suspends my credibility that that's how we go after a young white kid coming out of bars who was reported to have had a gun and not having his ID. It's very hard for me to believe that that's.
So is your question, can I run at someone who I believe, or who I'm attempting to detain, who has a firearm on them? Is that a good tactic, or is that what you're asking? Or because the other piece.
I'm saying it's an indication of bias that if there's a white person who had a gun who's walking out, and I don't have these suspicions, these preconceived notions based on their identity alone, because there's no specific threat, there's no specific act, there's no, you know, when we go back to the OPR report about, or sorry, the OPR report saying at the beginning that officers developed a reasonable articulable suspicion that the complainant had committed or may commit a criminal act. I don't hear that to be true in this case. Like, he had a gun, he didn't have his ID. So he's going back to his car. He, to our knowledge, is not aware that law enforcement is aware that he exists or that he has a gun. And so I think my challenge is running at someone seems to me to be responding to a different kind of threat than the threat that was reported. And that's where I get to bias.
So I don't want to relive case law, but again, this is something that I'm very familiar with. Look at the facts of Terry v. Ohio. Okay, that is the Supreme Court precedent that sets down reasonable articulable suspicion and investigatory stops for police officers. What happened in that case so long ago? There were individuals who were walking back and forth across a bank, okay? And that's what they were doing. They were just walking back and forth. They weren't doing anything other than that. They weren't saying anything. They didn't do anything other than walk back and forth. And the officer knew at the time that there was some nexus to this, there was some, that the area had, I believe, some previous incidents of crime that had occurred around there.
But that's two coordinated, repeated actions.
I understand that, sis. I'm using that as an example of saying, what crime were they committing when they were walking back and forth across a bank? The officer believes that they're attempting to rob a bank. He stops them, he frisks them, and he pulls a .38 caliber pistol out of one of their pockets. That's the history, and that's the genesis of the Terry v. Ohio decision about stopping, frisking, and investigatory stops.
So walking back and forth in front of a bank.
I understand that. So carrying a gun in a place that serves alcohol, and I think we've discussed this. Is there a reasonable articular suspicion to believe that a crime was committed or has been committed? We are attempting to enter a place that serves alcohol, okay? And we already talked about the potential misdemeanor crimes that are involved with carrying a concealed weapon and alcohol. You cannot drink alcohol when you carry a concealed weapon. You cannot be under the influence of alcohol when you carry a concealed weapon. You could be doing a whole host of other things, but those are two misdemeanor crimes that could potentially be happening when this takes place. And so that's the threshold. And reasonable articular suspicion is a very low bar. It is much lower than probable cause. It is much lower than beyond reasonable doubt. That is the threshold.
I hear you,
No, I
but
think-
at
I
the
think-
time of approach, he hasn't smelled alcohol on him. He didn't gain access to the bar. And I don't actually even know that he knows that he doesn't have his ID. He just knows he has a gun and is trying to boogie. Like those don't add up to,
And I think this is.
and again, I don't want to suggest that I don't have a vested interest in the community safety of Arlington County officers going and finding out why any gun is in Clarendon. With an ID, without an ID, concealed carry permit or not, I absolutely want ACPD officers to go and figure out who is carrying a gun and where they are and what they're doing. But do we have to run at them screaming profanities with violent threats? I don't think so. I don't think that was protecting the safety of the officer. I don't think that was de-escalating a situation, and I don't think it was necessary from the circumstances.
So I mean, I think there are differences between Terry and Ohio in this case, because they were casing a department store, I think, in that case. And they talk about the police officers' hunches, which I want police officers to be making connections that regular citizens don't make. And I think the initial problem got off on the wrong foot because the officer ran and shouted and said, "Get the fuck on the ground." But I'm also trying to look at this holistically. At a certain level, the guy ran towards danger. And I give him credit for that because, they are here to protect us. So I give him credit for that. And I think he's, thinking in his own mind, he's doing the right thing. This is a threat and I'm running towards it. But it was a mistake. I think it generated everything that followed. And, you guys said he was sustained the personal contact. So at a certain level, you think it was a mistake as well, or at least for saying.
What came out of his mouth was not okay.
I think where we're discussing is the running after, and I think we should just talk about what, at least what I think, what should have happened. Like, I don't think that was certainly the best result.
Yeah.
Because I think Julie's actually right. There wasn't any facts that indicated, I don't think that have been articulated, any kind of crime.
But also.
He's in Clarendon.
May
It's late at night.
have committed or committing. May have committed or
But
committing.
What?
But there's.
Well, I just
always
named two
responsibility
misdemeanors.
to de-escalate.
So we're talking about multitude of different things. And so I'll stop first, which is, I've just named two misdemeanors, like may have committed or committing, right? We were attempting to get into a bar. Has he been drinking? We don't know. Is that a crime to be under the influence and carrying?
Yes.
May have committed or committing. So those are the two thresholds. Very low bar. Very low bar.
Yeah.
You're a prosecutor,
Yeah,
reasonable particular
yeah.
suspicion
Yeah.
for an investigatory stop is a
Right.
very low bar. That's number one. Number two is we're talking about running up to someone. Or actually, let me stop there with what comes out of the officer's mouth. Okay, and I've said this repeatedly, and I'll say this to y'all. What comes out of his mouth is not okay. There's no one in ACPD that thinks that what came out of the officer's mouth is okay. But the actions of running towards, I could make 100 different tactical justifications of why closing the distance on an individual who I believe I am going to get into a gunfight with needs to happen. Okay, so I'm telling you that I can make 100 justifications as to why I'm okay doing that and why I understand why that needs to happen. Because my shot at 75 yards is different than my shot at 15 yards. Okay, I can probably do this at 15. 75, I'm like this all over the place. All right, so I can make that's one tactical justification. But I don't want to get into tactics about doing something. I think what we're doing right now is.
But that's not the tactical justification he gave.
So
And the policy says the officer has to be able to tactically justify their actions, and in the interview, he said, it appears he's trying to flee.
And then close the dip. So I don't want to go circle back to the previous discussion that we talked about, which is like, this is why we need answers a certain way. But I understand what you're saying. Okay, so I think what we're doing right now is what you want us to do is now hindsight, how this could have been done better, et cetera, et cetera. But hindsight is really not what we should be doing, right? And we kind of learned that from previous cases.
Can I interrupt you on that? Because I think this is actually the discussion that is most valuable. Because this is the guts of it, and it is hindsight. And I do agree that officers are required to make these split-second decisions, and I don't want the community to constantly be saying, to constantly be looking at hindsight. But it is partly hindsight that is valuable too, because honestly, this wasn't, in my mind, just as a community member, the ideal resolution. It really wasn't. And the guy really, yes, he could have been intoxicated. They didn't know that. So there are justifications. And maybe he tried to get in and had a drink and they didn't know that. So there are these misdemeanors. He definitely had reasonable, articulable suspicion. But is that the regular Terry stop that you want? Running after a guy saying, not just saying, but like, get on the effing ground. Take the words out of it. But and I'll shoot you. Is that really the right result?
No, we've said that's not the result we're looking for. One of the things I would point you to just reflect on is what I remember Officer 4 made a comment that he was, I think it was Officer 5 was much farther up, much closer to the person. So I believe he said he's trying to catch up to where she is too.
Because she was on the street with the cars.
But she was up closer to where the person was and he was farther back is how I understand it.
Yeah, correct.
And one of the things I remember him saying from when I read everything is he's trying to catch up to her too.
And that was 3.
And I think that's an important part.
That was 3.
3, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Right,
Officer
right,
three.
not
Too many
Officer
numbers.
three.
Right, right.
Another officer who's
Yeah, that
close
was-
to the.
Yeah,
Right.
that was
And
3.
he said he was trying to get up to where his partner officer was, and I think that's an important part. And then trying to contain a scenario to not let it continue to go. It's interesting when, if you're gonna pull over a car, if you speed past somebody, and the officer's sitting back off the side of the road, if the lights come on with a large gap, does that sometimes make somebody, I can get away from this? Would the person have run or not? You never know. That's the problem is you never know if somebody's.
You could radio somebody. I think there was a car that they had radioed that wasn't there someone in a car that was also looking, had come down the street earlier?
Not earlier, but there was a crash that had occurred like nearby, and so maybe they came from
Crash,
that.
right.
So,
Anyway, look, it is a split-second situation.
Well, but
But
to your point about that being the meat of it, right, is that the reason we keep coming back to this point isn't because this needs to be punitive and held up and said, was this split second, could another officer with similar qualifications come to the same decision? It's, are we responding to the frequency and circumstances where this is happening and saying, it is very serious to have a gun pointed at you and fear for your life. And in this instance, to Mummy's point, there's not really anything else here in the initial report, in the vehicle, and anything else that suggests that this was like an active and serious threat. Now, the presence of a gun, we want to know and we want to confirm that, and we don't want them wandering around. But I'm just having a hard time believing that this is how we would go up to some white kids, coming around Clarendon who also happens to have a gun, because I think that there was enough space and time and opportunity to do this in a non-escalating way that wouldn't have increased, that wouldn't be running towards danger and setting up these situations because.
So could we articulate just, and I don't want to spend too much time, but what the right result or the ideal result would be, which would be. I can see having.
Yeah, there's multiple ways to do it, and I'm sorry. Now I'm hearing what you're saying, which is like, if we were going to score this, does this get an A+? Probably not, right? It probably doesn't get an A+. Are there A scores that you can do that would be better? And probably, if thought out, and if we had a little bit more time to plan, like, hey, you go here, I'll go here, blah, 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 we'll intercept them there. Yeah, absolutely, 100%. And I think that's the point that you're getting at, Julie, is that could this have been done better? Yes, 100%.
But also, are there specific indicators that it was motivated by bias?
So I will tell you, no, but look at the time of day. I think that plays a factor in this, and that's what we're forgetting. It's the time of day and the area. It's the two things interwoven together. And as I'm listening to you say that, and I'm like, would this have happened at 12 o'clock in the afternoon in Clarendon? Like, whatever, probably not. Not like the way it did. But now we're talking about nightlife. We're talking about a highly congested area. We're talking about a lot of people drinking. We're talking about people that maybe already have consumed alcohol. I believe that the time of day that this occurred plays more of a factor in how this incident ended up being happened, whether or not, obviously it could have been handled better, but that plays a bigger role into how it was handled. The nighttime adds an added element. I cannot see as far. I don't actually know what this person is doing. Till I shine a light on them. I don't know what's happening. Are there people back there? There's less people out on the street. What is he attempting to do? The time of day, I believe, plays a bigger factor in this than, the notion that maybe race did. And to us, and to me, as I observe this, I don't believe that race played a factor in this. I believe that this was just a series of circumstances that came together that resulted in this, which obviously, to your point, could have been handled differently.
And unfortunately, we didn't, the way we classified it, we weren't able to ask the questions that actually delved into the race question. So we don't know, unfortunately, because we didn't do that. I take your point. I heard you should Monday morning quarterback. I don't like that statement in this context because if anyone who's played sports knows, what do we do the day after? We look at the tape. We do quarterback ourselves. We do look at what could be done better. And that gets kind of to your point, which again is part of why we're here. When we're talking about that co-creating, what we're trying to get to is how it should be done in a community of mutual respect, police and those who are police. That's what we're trying to get to. So that, David, you hit it right on the head. So it is helpful to us when we hear from ACPD the recognition of that we're trying to get there, because we know you're trying to get there too. But that we're both trying to get to that mutual understanding of how this can be done day or night. Because good policing is a day or night thing.
Yes, correct.
And how I'm treated, I want to be treated the same day or night. Okay?
That's fair.
I do. And to get past that, I think the key thing to get past is justification, because I've heard that term thrown around to so much that I'm not comfortable with it, because we can justify anything. And we need to get past justification to really then focus on, again, what we should be doing for good policing in a community that has this mutual respect, police and those who are police. That's my 2 cents on it. Madam Chair, I'm familiar, I'm looking at our time. I know we haven't even divided up our officers to go through, so I don't know where you want us to pivot, but I am recognize that it's about 8:40 right now.
Thank you.
Are there any other comments that
Yeah.
any COB members want to make? And then I want to make sure Jim has an opportunity.
I have one.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Just back on the bias thing, and I just want to quickly. First of all, in determining whether or not somebody's demonstrating bias, I think you have to look holistically. I know Julie's been talking about how Officer 4 approached the person, but was not Officer 4 also the person who said baby mama?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So you kind of have to look at these things holistically when you're trying to determine bias. And I also have some concerns that you didn't necessarily look at alleged policy violation of bias because the complainant didn't say they were biased against. I can tell you I've had certain situations that have happened to me where it's taken me quite a long time to realize that what just happened to me was based on either my race or my gender.
Yes.
And it really shouldn't be up to the complainant to say this was bias. We want all of us to get to a point where we can recognize bias without putting it on the complainant. But anyway,
I'm so glad you said that, Lisa, because I did the same conversation where, we're talking about how to develop investigating these bias-free policing allegations. And although the complainant didn't say I was treated a certain way because of my race, I agree with you that the impetus is not on the complainant to be able to articulate it that way. He said I was harassed multiple times in multiple ways, and harassment to me is a key word indicator of some sort of unfair treatment, which we should then explore. But on top of that, you have a subject matter expert and an auditor telling you this should be investigated as bias-free policing. And so I'm wondering, what is the harm, even if you don't necessarily as a department think that it's going to be a sustained allegation, or you're looking at it and you're like, it's not that. what is the harm of investigating it just to see if we can elicit the questions and dig deeper to see, even if it doesn't end up being a sustained allegation, which honestly, that is not the goal. For me, it's more so what do we learn from the officers' thinking and their actions that we can prepare them better for other interactions. And that's where I think we fall short in not exploring all of these conversations more in the investigations.
But starting with an allegation of bias policing, that is a serious allegation.
Yeah, and it was warranted in this situation.
Well, I think there's different ways to to dice it up based on which information. But I do think it's important to remember that is a serious allegation, and it cannot, I don't think it should be just used all the time to just solicit or to gather information. I don't agree with that.
I agree, but if you have an auditor telling you, I think in my professional opinion, this is a problematic statement, or this has, elements of bias, and also the complainant is saying, I feel like I was harassed, then does that not rise to the level of exploring it further? I'm asking in this specific circumstance.
Well, and the collection of facts as a whole, that we have this input from, and we talked at length about, I'm not gonna police what specific words police can use, but we are gonna take away a characteristic sentiment that someone's trying to boogie, someone's trying to shoot up a club because their baby mama might be in there. I feel like I'm missing something here, that like these circumstances do add up to a sentiment that the experience and the timeline and the dynamics here would have been different, and there would have been, and that the language wouldn't have applied, right? And so I do want to get into the individual.
But that wasn't a rhetorical question, was it?
No.
That wasn't a rhetorical. So she asked.
I think the response is
recommended, and then does that not rise to the level?
It's a significant, I don't want to get into a place, and it sounds to me like neither does the chief, of where we're just throwing this out willy-nilly, right? It's a serious allegation, and if there is cause for it, then we will do it. Now, there's a balance to be made, right? And we're learning this together.
Is it subject matter expertise giving the recommendation something you view as willy-nilly?
So I don't want to get into subject matter expertise. I'm a subject matter expertise in certain things too, and I offer my opinion about a lot of things that, as it relates to the subject matter.
Is it willy-nilly?
Sometimes it can be. It's taken into, what I'm saying is accepted as willy-nilly. But what I'm saying is everyone's opinion and their subject matter expertise needs to be respected. And there's a balance, right? I respect Mummy's opinion. And then I'm sure she respects my opinion on certain matters too. There's a balance to be met. And so we will continue to work through these things together as we move through these investigations. So for what you're asking is like, do I take the fact that she's a subject matter expertise in auditing? Yes, I do. So, but that has to be balanced with the agency and the way that we do things, right? I take that as, just because you're a subject matter expert, I will take your expert advice under consideration. So just as I hope that my expertise in certain matters is taken under consideration as well.
It is, and it's collaborative, but I think the point of an investigation is to get additional information, and we don't want to throw it around willy-nilly, but what we're saying is there was a specific recommendation from the auditor's office, and the group has some specific concerns about bias here that it would not have been willy-nilly to look at it in this way, especially in the context of, is it more often Black members of the community who end up the victims of the fatal mistakes, or is it not? Like we have consequence for that need also that's not willy-nilly.
Or at the very least, if you decide to dispel my recommendation, then it should be addressed in the report, just so we all are aware of what the analysis was.
That's fair.
Because the baby mama comment was not addressed at all in the report, and that was concerning. But I do think that a better practice would be if you have an oversight agency that is in the position of auditing the underlying department, if they make a direct recommendation for an allegation, that should be followed and pursued. It doesn't mean that the allegation needs to be sustained,
Right.
but it should be pursued. But I
It's
think
always
that
taken under advisement.
I think that at least is, that's a part of the working relationship of, I would hope that as we, have crossed the year threshold, that that when we are making recommendations, they're never willy-nilly. That they are things that have, I can point to specific statements and things that happened that led to that recommendation. But I think, we're talking about it from the perspective of like moving forward, how can we prevent us from having to speculate, what an allegation should have been or what the finding should have been if we on the front end are pursuing these conversations and getting as much information out of these investigations as possible so that we can make well-informed decisions, because there might have been things that were revealed in the investigation that would have dispelled the concerns. You know what I mean? There's pros and cons to doing it.
Sure.
But also I just wanted to make sure, Jim, you walk back in. I wanted to make sure you had an opportunity to weigh in if you had anything to say.
I want to land
Thank you.
on solution that it sounds like we can all agree on, that if there is a recommendation that's not adopted, that it just be addressed so that the analysis is in the report for us.
I
to
think that's
consider.
fair. And I want to make it clear
Yeah.
that her recommendations are always taken under consideration. It's just, but I don't always follow. I mean, that's just the reality. It's like, I get it. Like, yes, she's a subject matter. I always take her recommendations under consideration. It's just, sometimes I accept them and sometimes I don't. So.
I like having a solution. I don't want to preclude other comments before we go to individual officer breakdown and vote. Nika, Lisa? Okay. All right, how to best do this? Let's start with personal contacts, where we have OPR and IPA's findings are both sustained. Lisa's and my recommendation be to sustain. Do I hear a vote to adopt the recommendation?
Motion to adopt the recommendation.
Second? All in favor, aye?
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? Abstentions? Okay, I'll adopt that recommendation.
So specifically, that's officer
For-
for personal
For
contacts.
personal contacts. Okay. For duty responsibilities. Officer 1, where we have this input in the interview about not going to the detail. Some of our other considerations were about the overall length of the detainment, the extensive questioning of certain, I guess that's separate, and kind of failure to absorb the inputs. Our recommendation is not sustained. I don't think that we can prove that there was a violation of duty responsibility there, but that we can't exonerate it from that finding either. Do we want to discuss or clarify that recommendation? Does anyone have a different view? So can we move to not sustain duty responsibility, Lisa?
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have a motion to not sustain duty responsibilities for Officer 1?
I'll second.
All in favor, aye? Aye. Any opposed, nay? Abstentions? Okay. Officers 2, 3, and 5, our recommendation is exonerate.
I'm sorry, which one are they on?
We're still on duty responsibility.
Duty responsibilities,
Okay.
officers 2, 3, and 5. Differing here slightly from OPR's finding was exonerated 1, 2, and 4. We're looking at 1, 2, and 5. Officer 5 was not included in OPR's recommendations, but is in the IPA report.
And so for clarification, if we're voting on officers 2, 3, and 5 for duty responsibilities, we're sort of chopping out the search and seizure which relates to the inventory search.
Yes.
Okay.
So the recommendation was to exonerate 2, 3, and 5.
I'll move to exonerate 2, 3, and 5 under duty responsibilities.
Second? All in favor, aye.
Aye.
Any abstentions? Nay. Okay. Okay, then Officer 4 for duty responsibilities. The recommendation being to sustain the violation because of an unnecessary escalation being, de-escalation being part of the duty. Do we have questions, differences of opinion, additional discussion? Okay, I wasn't sure if we were contemplating. So do we have a motion to adopt the recommendation to sustain duty responsibility violation for Officer 4?
Also move.
Second? All in favor, aye?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, nay? Abstentions? Okay, so that we're done with personal contacts, duty responsibilities, moving to the search and seizure. We have officers 1, 2, and 5. OPR's findings were not sustained for 1 and 2. IPA's findings for 1 was sustained, 2 was exonerated, 5 sustained. 2 being exonerated, I think because the IPA did a good deep dive into the legal precedent that it didn't qualify as a search.
Shining a flashlight into a car is not a search.
So do it right. And it was with Dave's help, which we should always highlight because it's so valuable. Thank you. So our recommendation, let's do Officer 2 first, would be to exonerate search and seizure for Officer 2. Any differing viewpoints or conversation? Motion to adopt the recommendation to exonerate Officer 2.
So moved.
Second?
I'll second.
All in favor, aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Abstentions? Great. Okay, Officer 1. OPR has that as not sustained. IPA has it as sustained. Our recommendation is that it is sustained. We can take a little bit more time to talk about this because we got focused on the front end of the investigation. To me, the recommendation for sustained is that I think that it's possible that you could be looking for contraband and valuables, but I think that the input from the person saying like that there's cash in the center he wasn't aware of, that there's, I think ACPD has this recorded input from him saying there's nothing else of value in the car, that their liability was kind of low. But more importantly, I don't think we're looking for valuables in the potato chip bag. And I don't think we had any reason to suspect that there were the kinds of contraband like fentanyl in there. And so even if that was to be thorough, the comment that I feel like I'm missing something gives me a very clear indication that this was a search for something, not a search to be sure that nothing was there. And I get that that's a fine distinction, but I think the takeaway from that comment made it very plain that there was a suspicion that was being tested here, not an administrative protocol. So that was the base of our recommendation for sustaining that was an inventory search or an evidence search, a search for evidence conducted under the guise of an inventory search that did not turn up evidence of something else.
So this was a tough one.
Yeah.
I thought factually it was pretty close. And I will make a point to the board, I guess, in terms, or maybe the county, that I do think the independent auditor needs a Westlaw account. I mean, because it can't be that expensive. And honestly, while you can make judgments based on policy, it is helpful to have a factual background. And Captain Kim, you're well versed in the law, and while not every officer on the street knows exactly every case, it is helpful to have that. And I think for an independent auditor to do a review, having legal research is just a basic part of the job. And we came across this one case called Knight versus Commonwealth, which was actually a case involving a search of a vehicle after a traffic stop.
And it wasn't the Virginia Supreme Court, it was the appellate middle level court that said it was an improper inventory search. And it was under like Newport News or some different jurisdiction's policy. But the court described the officers being all excited because they said, "No, we got an inventory search. Now we can go look for stuff." And they were clearly looking for evidence. It's a hard thing to figure out because you have the authority to go look for stuff. And if you individually, personally feel like I'm going to find something, I don't think that's wrong to also bring that into the search. And so, I mean,
What year was that?
2020, 2020. Yeah.
Can I just add to that, though, is that, case law is always very important, but I just want to put it out there that my staff is my question. So we're really focused on what our policy says.
Yeah,
If there's recommendations that we need to change policy, that's an easy conversation, but, my staff I just want to be clear that I don't think we're judging based on what all the cases say, because they don't have them. So it's really about, is there something with our policy? Because our role here is our policy, is it a policy violation? Because the officers don't have access.
Yeah, no, that's a fair
But
point.
in this case, having access to being able to do that legal research means we can exonerate an officer for a finding that absent that tool was not sustained.
But
Yeah,
I just think
that's
it's
what we're
really,
saying.
I just want to put that out there, that it's not, an officer is held to our policy. And if our policy is division, that's a different conversation.
But how would we know if we
I'm
don't have
not,
access?
I'm not
to
arguing, the voice law, I'm not even arguing, that's not a thing at all for me. I just wanted to make
Oh,
that
clarify,
point.
yeah.
That's it.
But the metric for
That's
your
not my
evaluation is,
The policy.
right,
And
Judge the officer on the policy, that's what the chief
Right,
was saying.
right.
but what I'm,
I just said it really long.
no, I hear you, and I agree that like,
Yeah, chief.
and we've had this conversation about like if we are Monday night quarterbacking, it's not for the purposes of punitively assessing an officer's choice. It's about assessing whether or not there is an opportunity, whether through policy or protocol, to move along. That also the IPA's role in this, and then our role, is to add additional context where that can be helpful, right? That like when we're trying to do policy research and trying to understanding the cases available beyond this specific policy. So I appreciate you making that point.
But I just want to just make sure I reinforce what the chief is saying. So when you're voting on an officer's actions, though, it is the actions
Absolutely.
as it relates to
Policy.
the
Yeah, policy,
policy
absolutely.
that is currently
Right.
written.
Yeah.
So,
I think
yeah.
we're all kind of saying the same thing in a way. We're not insinuating that when you look at a policy violation that you should go and research all the case law, then how different courts have interpreted specific factual circumstances. What I think we should be doing, though, is if a policy, like use of force, for example, is based on Graham versus Connor, we should have tools to be able to go and look at that case law and understand how the factors are, the standards of that particular, precedent may impact a policy. And then from my perspective, in terms of just auditing or providing input on policy, it's helpful to be able to look at, legal research to be able to give input to the department on whether it's not an officer's, conduct or misconduct, but that a policy may need to be revised, or that it's not clear, or that it's not in compliance with what, recent standards are. And these standards change all the time, especially when you're talking about things like Fourth Amendment jurisprudence, like that's constantly evolving. So being able to just be, up to par on that. But if you're saying policy violations and the policy is literally quoting a case or like is based on, precedent or standards that are articulated in the case, that's what I think we should certainly be referencing. But, we can't compare it to every factual circumstance
Right.
of individual cases, obviously.
Well, in this instance, what we're voting on is the ACPD policy that does very clearly at the tail end of explaining what's the purpose of an inventory search, what is authorized in terms of closed
Right.
containers and not closed containers. The trunk was,
Right.
totally irrelevant to the conversation, but that the last paragraph is so explicit in saying an inventory, a search for evidence shall not be conducted under the guise of an inventory search. That's where I'm hearing this comment and thinking, the reason that this is in this policy is because this is a specific distinction that we want to make in Arlington, that when we're doing this, we're doing it for the right reasons, and we're not using it as administrative cover for bias or other, decision-making that might not be consistent with the ACPD policy. So the recommendation here is explicitly based on ACPD policy, not broader case law or other research.
Officer Ford did quote the case law though, to his credit,
I mean,
like
so-
he literally
yeah.
said, look it up. And that's what the policy is based on, yeah.
So a lot of the cases that we look at, officers are citing the case law. So, and as you pointed out, Chief, it evolves, right? I mean, you right into it evolves. So it's just that we haven't fully throughout the county built ourselves the tool. We have a county attorney, so of course we have a Westlaw LexisNexis account. We do. Be interesting to see what we can do to make sure that other branches of our other facets, rather, of our county staff who, may need that tool can be, given an account, one account, perhaps for office, one account for the police officer, just to have that tool there if necessary. It's going to be, it's not a crutch, but just a tool to have, air on the quiver.
Well, in the
That's
same
the
way,
question.
I would like to have the OPR report just specifically address if we're not going to adopt some IPA recommendation. When we do this, we can make sure that we're explicit in when we're voting on the actions versus making policy recommendations or other things, that it's predicated specifically on ACPD policy. Sorry, Anika.
I did have a question. I hate to backtrack, but
No.
real quick, when the officers interacted with the bouncers, did they interact with the bouncers? And if they did, were their cameras, why weren't their cameras on? They didn't interact with the bouncers?
The body-worn camera footage wasn't collected because that wasn't really part of an incident yet. And what the officers described in their interview is that the bouncer came up and approached them to let them know that somebody had had a gun, and that's based on instruction that ACPD has given to these business owners to say, we need to know if there are guns in and around here. And so specifically at this bar, where there is a regular practice of patting everyone down before they come in, they have had reports of guns, and so that's why the bouncer kind of knew to go and talk to ACPD. So to Mummy's
the
point.
cameras are just not running when anyone comes up.
A consensual encounter does not require ACPD officers to activate their body-worn camera. It's typically not done in nightlife because people come up to you all the time and say, hey, can you tell me how to get to bar so-and-so? Can you tell me how to get to, I can't find my car. So it's just, we would be turning our cameras on all the time.
Yeah.
Okay. And one more question. The whole mistaken identity, they don't have, when y'all pull up the, because it's obviously mistaken identity with his name being the exact same name and the date of birth of someone in Las Vegas. They don't have pictures and stuff because that was a long interrogation.
It depends on what database you go to. If you're looking at it through the computer, the answer is no. There will not be a picture that appears.
That's a problem.
So that's just old technology. I mean, we're talking about a system that was developed, God, I don't even know when NLEX was developed, but we're talking about literally like an antiquated system, a network that, like law enforcement uses to share information, so.
I guess that's how it is.
Good questions.
Okay, so for search and seizure, we're looking at Officer 1. We exonerated Officer 2. We're looking at Officer 1 in the conduct of an inventory search and the comment. I feel like I'm missing something. The recommendation to sustain. Do we have additional discussion or a motion to adopt?
You look like you want to say something.
I think this is hard factually. Even though the case that we discussed, I haven't discussed it with everybody, but it's a little bit more factually over the top. And I hadn't really thought about looking for contraband or fentanyl. But I do think that actually they were looking for, I think it was, in their mind, it was more than just an inventory search because of their reactions. But I'm not sure what they factually should have done differently. Like, they're expressing their internal emotions and thoughts, like, oh, I'm gonna find something. But I think legally they could have done everything that they did.
I agree. If we had no evidence of intention or.
I guess I have a hard time with the justification of looking at the chip. I'm not putting it down. Please don't tell me it's a fentanyl because the tow truck driver did not see the fix on the car. So, I mean,
Well,
I'm just not, I just don't know.
I agree, I hear your point, which is, if that comment wasn't there, we would have to, at best, or at worst,
Say
not sustain.
Not sustain.
Because there
Right,
wouldn't be
right,
specific
right,
facts
right,
for
which
us to,
Right.
right? And the idea here being that the way that the search was conducted, to me credibly, doesn't seem to be exclusively for valuables when you have this person saying whatever. It seems very exhaustive for the kind of contraband that would be indicated kind of generally by circumstance. Now, fentanyl being new and a newer threat that's emergent and maybe amorphous, I can't really contend with, because I think on the whole, when we look at what's happened all night, right? This is 2 hours of interaction with this guy who, like, we've kind of badgered him with questions about whatever, and we actually never really found anything other than he's probably should have left his gun in the car before he ever left the house to do whatever he was doing, which is not a non-trivial miscalculation, but we haven't found anything else in the looking for facts that is beyond the scope of that threat, right? Like, we didn't find gobs and gobs of cash. We didn't find, tons and tons of drugs. So we're not finding drug charges that say that this person has a history of being involved in, criminal activity. What we have is a very contained set of circumstances and a secondary traffic stop that was still, I think, a little bit drummed up, given the circumstances of someone else showing up in the records as having the same name and date of birth, that the comment just, I don't know, and we can vote differently.
Right,
So
I think we're ready to go.
Okay. Okay, so I have a motion to adopt, motion to second the motion. Do I have a second on the motion to adopt? Lisa moved to adopt our recommendation. Do we not have a second?
I'm just not sure.
Yeah,
That's fine, it's fine not to be sure.
well, we can vote on it and
I'll give it a
not
second,
adopt
so
it.
we'll give it a second.
Yeah, and then everybody can vote the way they think is
Mhm.
appropriate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All in favor of adopting the recommendation to sustain the search and seizure allegation against Officer 1, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any nay? Any opposed? Nay. Abstentions? Cool. Okay. Officer 5 is the last one, participated in the search and said, why are we getting such a big reaction? To me, for similar reasons, I think that is participating in an evidence search under the guise of an inventory search. There is less kind of content from the body-worn camera footage and interactions for Officer 5. So if anyone wants to discuss or clarify roles or actions, or we can
And the recommendation for 5 is?
stand. Do I hear a motion to adopt the recommendation? Second? All in favor of adopting the recommendation to sustain the search and seizure allegation against Officer 5? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Nay.
Nay.
Abstentions? Nays. Cool. Okay, so we don't need to vote on bias-free policing and use of force, but we do want to note that it seems like both of those things would have been valuable information to collect as part of this investigation. I think that from a previous conversation we had about the policy around pointing a gun at someone, we've had that conversation. I think in this circumstances, we do have to make a big deal out of the unideal outcome without necessarily pointing to can the office, do we need to go after the officer for that specific thing? I think in this case, the serious act of pointing a weapon compounded with the language that ACPD, OPR, IPA, and the COB all kind of wholesale understand personal contacts violation. Now, the remaining part of the discussion we have is to vote on the sufficiency of discipline for OPR's sustained violation. I would really benefit from a quick break before we do that and then close out, but I know we're towards the end. Can we take a break? 5 minutes?
I'm fine with that. Do you,
Okay.
do you want to keep moving?
Energy?
I keep going, but if they can take a break, we can take a break, but I can keep going.
Yeah, I can keep going.
Okay, let's power through. So as we have this conversation, noting that there are sensitivities about confidentiality that are going to come up in different situations. What I'll say is, I am specifically aware of the disciplinary actions involved in the sustained allegation of personal contacts violation against Officer 4.
Right.
I think what you might be getting to is where there's a disciplinary history of similar findings,
I'm getting,
and maybe we want
I
to.
need clarification on, from my reading, Officer 4's special role that they have to the role they have, okay,
Yeah.
right.
Got it?
It was not clear to me from the disciplinary letter that was there that role has ended. That role can still continue after, can still continue. And that's very concerning to me that given the repeated nature of these, that role was not noted as being taken away, but there was other discipline that was given. The role, if I can be more specific about the role.
I would try to avoid that if possible, but I know what
Okay.
you're saying. Your question is, what is your question? Which is like, because there was a holistic approach that was taken with this officer that I believe were effective. And I guess what you're trying to get is a very specific answer to a very specific, but I'm trying to
Right,
understand your question.
that I saw time away.
Yep,
Okay. And I saw impacts on pay, but I didn't see impacts on other roles.
there
or
was, there
responsibilities.
100% was.
Okay, I didn't see that articulated there. So other roles and responsibilities, could they be resumed again after a certain period, or is that it for this very specific role and responsibility that impacts?
I think when
Others.
we issue any sort of disciplinary act
Yes.
against an individual,
Yeah.
broadly, in broad terms, there has to be a path forward for an individual. Now, there are going to be circumstances when there is no path forward for an individual. But what the agency tries to do is make a determination on whether or not a path forward is applicable in a specific set of circumstances. Are there things that can be done that would not provide an avenue for a path forward? Yes, you can absolutely do things that would not allow you to move a path forward. But those are few and far between. We
Right.
always, as an agency, want to provide opportunities for officers and to have them understand this is a mistake or whatever it is, these acts need to end. There is a path forward for you for redemption. I think that is what we're trying to do. There has to be a path
But are
forward
there
for
certain
people.
roles that are there certain extra roles, responsibilities that one can disqualify themselves from in the future if there's a pattern?
If certain things happen, yes. Can you disqualify yourself from having extra duties if you do certain things? Yes, 100%.
But everything
and I
depends on the ongoing body of work. And this is an incident, everything in the moving forward depends on a totality of an entire body of work.
So
So that's a harder point to get to.
Right, because, I mean, when there appears, especially in the near term, at least from what I saw, that this isn't, over a long period of time. This is something that's happened, in a fairly concise period of time. This reoccurrence of looking at this particular type of conduct. So it seems as though that if that's the case, then it's been shown that perhaps, there's ways to continue staying in just the overall role, but special roles may not be, certain special roles, in fact, may not be the one that someone who's evidenced this type of behavior should be allowed to maintain, because that may spoil the bunch.
Right, but I mean, at some point, if somebody does something, in this case aside, and they get disciplined, that discipline doesn't drag along with them forever.
Okay.
So if somebody does something so egregious that there's no path for them, then they probably don't belong in the profession anymore. So, is there something where we would say, in any generic scenario, not this, where here's your discipline and for the next 20 years, you can't do this? I don't think so.
yeah, I want to
It
abstract
depends
a
on
level.
the whole body of work and how things go and what the future holds. I mean, that's a harder question to answer.
If we abstract this up a level and just be purely generically,
Yep.
if I make a fatal mistake and shoot someone and it's a clear policy violation and I'm, part of my discipline is criminal, prosecution, and I'm removed from my qualification for this profession, there's a finality to that.
I know.
Other probably non-criminal violations that could also disqualify you from participating in the profession in the future, right? Like,
Yep.
I think there's been an increasing recognition that if you are found to be guilty of domestic violence, right? Like, probably not suited to carry a weapon anymore, right?
Right.
So in that spectrum, right, where we're getting at, there's some things that it wouldn't be until 20 years and then you can come back, because it would be categorical that if you're not qualified for this role, you can't be requalified for this role. And I think what you're asking is, in this situation, can maybe Captain Kim lead the description of, you talked about consideration of the larger context and, why personal context, for example, was a more appropriate violation for the contextualized goal.
Yep.
Than conduct unbecoming, because when we read conduct unbecoming, it looks similar. And so
It does.
maybe if you can lead that, it would give us the insight
Yeah, I'll
without
just-
needing to get.
And hopefully this answers your question,
Yeah.
Charles, too, which is like, if we want to take a holistic approach with an employee, and there is a pattern that we've uncovered, the best thing as an agency that we can do, if it is a violation of that specific policy, is to make sure that we're exhibiting that the pattern continues. That is a way for us to take a holistic approach on what to do with an employee. Okay, so there's two different sides to this. One is disciplinary and one is training and other than a better term, rehabilitation, right? Thank you very much. Professional development. So there is a sort of mixing here, but there's the disciplinary side and then there's the professional development side. And those two things in this particular case, we took a holistic approach with this employee to make sure that we were addressing both. But in order to round out the conversation with professional development and meet, rather than just skirting around, is there a path forward? We always try, unless there's something crazy, we have to make a path forward to employees, because we can't have employees that don't feel like there's a path forward? What is the motivation of an employee to continue to do a hard work, do their due diligence, if they feel that there is no path forward? And this is true in society. If someone as a member of society feels that there's no path forward for them, what motivates them to get up every day, bust their hump, do a good job at work, whatever? There always has to be a path forward. There are going to be certain things that obviously disqualify you. But unless something like that happens, there is going to be a path forward. We're a microcosm of a society.
I do take your point. But, there's many unique paths and roles
Sure.
within the department. It seems as though that there are certain paths that you get access to if you reach certain qualifications.
Sure.
And there's certain paths that you don't have access to.
Yeah.
And what I'm hearing is all paths are still open.
To an employee, to this employee,
Like, all paths, all roles.
to this employee,
Yeah.
yes. Yes. Yes.
And everything depends on the entire body of work and how things go from when something happened moving forward.
And the current path that employees on, what I saw is it didn't even address if they're still in that path, in that walk on that path or not. And so it talked about discipline in terms of, hours and other things, but didn't talk about different paths that person was on and if those walking on those paths right now has been impacted or not. I just want to get clarity on that.
Yeah. So, and like I said, without getting too specific with the discussion, holistic approach,
Can I offer-
many things that were
Can
done.
I just offer
Yeah.
that maybe when we're talking about paths, to just be as generic and still accurate as we are, just like we have discipline versus professional development, we have like leadership and specialty, right? And there being different kind of opportunities that
Right.
if I'm part of a cake baking specialty, that if I have a hygienic problem on a recurring basis, I probably am at some point not suited for cake baking. And I think that's
Right,
what.
but
you're getting.
I'm still gonna let you in the kitchen and do other things
Right, you
that
can
we
wash
do. And you
dishes.
and you may end up supervising other things or doing other roles, but cake baking, that's just not you.
And so I wonder
Because
if,
it may hurt the other cake bakers.
yeah, I wonder if maybe you want to speak to what are the path isn't automatically open, right? The path is subject to incremental review.
Correct.
Such that if what I'm saying is, you're gonna get some hygiene classes, we're gonna get you some better soap, we're gonna.
I like this
you know,
analogy.
Right?
Right.
Blah, 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 whatever. I'm still gonna come and check on you that you are using the new soap, that you are,
It's a good analogy.
Right.
you know,
But you
whatever.
still get to be a cake baker during that time? I'm not sure. Maybe you should be doing other things in the house
No, I
and
don't,
not cake baking. And I didn't see that I saw that cake baking continues on.
I thought that during a period of professional development, while you're getting the specialized tools and
I didn't see
facilities, that I would not be in a role to bake cakes.
Correct.
Yeah, I didn't see that.
Correct.
I didn't
You are
see that.
correct. You are 100% correct. There is no cake baking. When you
Okay.
are, I want to make, maybe, is that your question?
That is absolutely right,
baking.
because I did
No
not
cake
see
baking.
that.
Yeah.
Nope.
Can I
But
just-
cake baking could happen in the future.
Yes.
Yes.
Interesting.
If I may, so, I do think that, maybe Captain Kim is not underscoring this, because he doesn't want to get into a lot of specifics, but there were definitely some actions that were proactively taken from the police department to, I guess if you guys are using this kitchen analogy.
Let's go with it. Keep going.
To, reassess the roles in the kitchen, and in the meantime, those roles were, suspended for a period of time.
Right.
And so I think that's a good proactive measure, while, doing
Right.
this assessment, while providing the tools and the training and that sort of thing. I think that's to be commended,
Okay.
that was done.
Okay.
And I do think that's not the end of the analysis, right? So for me, this whole discussion is around whether the discipline was sufficient or not sufficient, right? it's hard for me as an auditor to make an assessment about whether or not the discipline was sufficient if the underlying disciplinary conversation, or at least like what I received in writing, does not contain a pattern assessment. And that, for me, just there's a certain number of repeated similar types of allegations that should certainly trigger a pattern assessment. And maybe one of the things that we take away from this is that, and this probably will help kind of specifically tailor this discussion because we'll have some of this information on the front end, is that in this, and we're all still developing, right? Like what level of information, obviously, like the police department wasn't writing for this specific audience when, doing these sort of assessments in the past and how they notate those things. But I think the more information we have in the materials that we receive in terms of what factors they, analyze and whether a pattern assessment was done or not, I imagine that some level of assessment was done, but I don't know to what extent and what was factored into it. And I think we should actually play a role in that pattern assessment, or certainly I could, and because I'm involved in the investigation on the front end, to make sure that that all those factors are being taken into consideration, but also so that we have an understanding of what was factored into that, because I think that speaks to the sufficiency of the discipline on one part, and then I think it speaks to this part of the conversation that we're having right now, which is the conversation about like what do we do with this officer. I wholeheartedly agree with, but for certain very serious situations, that everyone should have a path forward in terms of redemption and regaining whatever those responsibilities are. I think that we also have to balance that as a society and as a department with the risks associated with that, managing the liability, where if you see that there's a certain pattern and that, everybody has different skill sets, right? And if we have a concern that maybe this particular role does not align with that person's skill set, that there is a path forward, but as you said, maybe it's a different path forward. Maybe the conversation is, was that length of time where that role was removed sufficient? Is that long enough? And then the other ask I want to make is that when this, whatever the period of time is concluded, that there's a report out of what the results of that were, and that there should be some collaboration, particularly where there is a concern about an officer's particular roles or duties, that there is some collaboration or insight given as to like whether that person, there's any additional concerns or any additional training that needs to happen, or whether or not the officer should return to that particular role, or maybe something different. It's my hope that like becomes a practice with more like collaboration and time. But I definitely would say that in my report, I specifically request like that there should be some sort of update around what transpires with this person. And I have no reason to think that it's not a success story, right? Like there might be a lot of great things that came out of the training and, the conversations and the resources that they're being given. But I think we should certainly I'm not talking specifically about this officer, I'm saying broadly, that when a pattern assessment is done or, duties are removed, that there should be some sort of like checks and balance system before those duties are reinstilled. So for me, that's why I think like I don't know that I really felt strongly that I had sufficient information to say sustained or not sustained. I'm sorry, sufficient or insufficient. But I did think that it was commendable that there were some proactive measures taken. I do think that there should probably be more analysis done on these types of situations before we decide what the path forward is.
Thank you. I think that conversation is useful. Again, we will build this muscle a little better. If anyone has any other questions, I'll say, I think, and again, I did have a conversation with Captain Kim about this in detail, in context, definitely not to the level of, a pattern assessment and that kind of results, but I think that the recommended discipline for this situation is sufficient because it includes the kind of gate reviews that say you can't go back to, your beloved cake baking until you've demonstrated a pattern of and ability to something. I also want to say that part of this process, especially the disciplinary sufficiency, does come to our relationship with ACPD and OPR's ability to kind of take into account broader facts that we have visibility into as of now, but not the same kind of subject matter expertise and history. So, because of where we are in this process, I think that, I mean, to address Mummy's last point about updates over time, I guess the recourse, if we don't get updates and it wasn't effective, is that this person might pop up again, and that our opportunity for pattern assessment will be that if officers are either not found, violations aren't sustained or discipline isn't sufficient and they keep popping up, then we have the transparency to say, there's a pattern here, it's not being addressed effectively, yada, yada, yada. So based on where we are in this process, my recommendation is that this is sufficient because it includes guardrails and oversight that I think OPR has come to the table to hear our concerns. I think that as we get into this, a lot of what we're finding is, there are kind of three parts of this discussion. One of which is what is the policy review of this specific instance based on the policies at the time and the information that was available then? What is the broader context and policy analysis and recommendations? And then what is our solution and action path forward amongst this team? Like OPR can address any unadopted recommendations by the IPA in the report, so we have that. So in my head, there's these kind of three portions, and based on where we are in our nascency, I'm inclined to take the information given and say that I think that there are substantial consequences in different dimensions, in addition to future gate reviews, that I'm comfortable with the level of discipline in this instance for a personal context violation. My caveat is I do wish that we had looked at this for a broader context of use of force and bias-free policing, and given the current policy around use of force not being violated in the way that ACPD has that policy now, that's my context, not my opinion on the specific finding. So does anyone have additional questions about that before we would hear a motion to adopt a recommendation that discipline is sufficient?
Oh. Also move.
Okay, second. Okay, all in favor of adopting the recommendation that discipline is sufficient? Aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay? Any abstentions?
Because I'm with Mummy, where I'm not certain. I don't want to say it was insufficient. I'm just not certain. So I support Mummy's position.
I think that's helpful. Okay, we are at time, a little over, and I don't know that the other elements on our agenda are tonight time sensitive. So unless you have any critical updates you want to address today, I think we could move to adjourn early, but I want to give you that window.
I can save my report out, but I think we should ask if there's any public comment.
Oh, yes, sorry. I don't want to skip public comment. Yeah, we have lots of people engaged online and present with us in person. So we'll do 10 minutes of public comment before pushing the rest of our agenda to our next meeting, which is May.
May what?
I know.
Second.
May 8th, technically. I think we'd be looking at May 8th and May 22nd, but we haven't talked about the 22nd.
I'll be out of town.
Okay, I'll coordinate with you guys on the second date, but May 8th is our regular scheduled meeting.
Do we know if we have any public comment?
I don't think we got any specific requests for public comment. I just did notice that we have had lots of people join us this evening.
One hand raised.
Yeah, there's, perfect.
Hey, good evening. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thanks so much for allowing me the opportunity to speak. I know it's late, and I'll try to keep my comments brief to respect everyone's time. My name is Mike Heminger. I serve as the president of the NAACP Arlington branch. As I'm sure you know, the NAACP is the nation's oldest and largest civil rights organization. I wanted to begin just my quick comments by saying that I'm grateful that everyone in this incident made it home safe that night, both our officers and the individual that raised this concern. When I think about the purpose of what this oversight board serves, I'm reminded that each of these incidents is an opportunity for us as a community collectively to slow down, to review the facts, and to see if there are opportunities to improve. I'm curious if the officer was led to believe that the gentleman had committed, was committing, or was about to commit a crime. There has to be something beyond being told that the individual is seeking to enter the bar with a concealed firearm. That conversation ultimately became the impetus for everything that seemed to follow. Captain Kim, tonight you mentioned that there could have been a potential for a gunfight, and I'm curious to understand what may have led to a belief that the individual was about to be a participant in a gunfight. If the officers were not led to believe that a crime had been committed, was being committed, or was about to be committed, then we should all seek to understand what caused the officer ultimately to run towards that individual, which escalated the incident. For clarity, based on my reading of the law that was cited tonight, it is not a violation of the law to bring a concealed weapon into an establishment that serves alcohol. Here's what the law says. I want to quote it for the record. A person who carries a concealed handgun onto the premises of such a restaurant or club and consumes alcoholic beverages is guilty of a class 2 misdemeanor, end quote. So regardless of how we all may feel personally, and I, want to align myself with some of the comments of tonight, the fact of the matter remains that it's not a violation of the law to simply enter an establishment that serves alcohol with a concealed weapon. I wanted to be clear on that. Ultimately, it appears that the officer's actions followed what they believe to be a violation of the law, when in fact, in my reading, as the law is written, it is not a violation of the law. While the establishment as a private business certainly has the authority to decide, who will and will not come in, the law as it's written currently does permit individuals to enter establishments serving alcohol with a concealed firearm. If we don't like the way that specific law is written, then we all have an obligation to have conversations with our lawmakers to change that law. Captain Kim, to speak frankly, I am a little disappointed in what you've decided regarding personal contact versus conduct unbecoming. Based on the policy most recently revised in 2021, that policy reads, the conduct of employees on or off duty may directly reflect upon the Arlington County Police Department. Employees shall conduct themselves at all times, both on and off duty, in such a manner to reflect most favorably upon the department in Arlington County. Conduct unbecoming by a police employee is any conduct that adversely affects the operations, morale, or efficiency of the department, or any conduct that has a tendency to adversely affect, lower, or destroy public respect and confidence in the department or any employee. If we think that some of the officers' conduct most favorably reflects on Arlington and the department, and if we believe that you truly don't think that those comments or behavior destroy public respect and confidence, then I will say that I have more questions than answers tonight, unfortunately. If this behavior does not rise to this level, then I would like to learn what does. On behalf of the communities that we serve at NAACP, as a resident and a leader in this community, I will tell you clearly that the comments from some of these officers do not meet my expectations for what I expect from the police department in our community. We all share the goal tonight that we want to make our community safer. When these comments, many of which are clearly rooted in racial bias, go unchecked or unchanged, we lose and not gain credibility with community stakeholders, and ultimately That becomes an erosion of trust in law enforcement, and it does not make our community safer. Ultimately, our prayer is that these discussions lead to action within Arlington, and our position, that position our department as the very best in the nation. That's our expectation of Arlington Police Department as community members and as leaders in the community. I think we all know that in 1 nanosecond, the outcomes of these interactions could be vastly different. I'd much rather have tough conversations now than to have tough conversations after an incident so serious arises that we look back at the data, and when we look back at the patterns, and when we look back at the culture, we see that the signs were there for us all along. I'll close with the subject of bias since it was mentioned often tonight. It seems clear to me that there is some overlay of several biases present. Some of the comments not only demonstrate implicit bias, but explicit spoken and articulated bias. One bias we didn't mention was confirmation bias. According to Britannica Online, confirmation bias is people's tendency to process information by looking for or interpreting information that is consistent with their existing beliefs. I would be pleasantly surprised to learn that this officer used terms like baby mama, boogie, or other racially charged terms universally across all interactions that they have in public. And if that's actually true, then I hope that someone would coach this officer about the appropriateness of these terms and their impact on historically marginalized communities. I'll close by saying it's an opportunity for all of us to look more broadly, to be curious to see if this behavior is happening across the department, and to see if other officers are conducting themselves in such a manner. We should seek to learn if this was an isolated incident or if it's part of a larger culture, pattern, or behavior within the department. If we can't look back at singular incidents and identify patterns, trends, and themes, then unfortunately we'll never be able to take these micro learnings and apply them on a more macro level to begin to influence the culture and pattern or behaviors in a meaningful way. And I'd like to challenge us all to think more deeply about this. Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate your input. We appreciate the community joining us for these conversations. Definitely want to reflect our shared understanding of your purpose of using this opportunity to slow down and review facts in a proactive posture, in a co-creation spirit, and in a solution-oriented mindset. And I am grateful for all of the time that everyone spends coming here to do this. It is a lot of time and it is late. So, JD, please.
So I won't be as long as Mike, and it was with the intention that I came here tonight, being that before this board was even put together, back in 2020, I, along with many other folks, fought hard for its existence against a lot of pushback. But what I'm somewhat appalled at tonight, as a community leader, is one is of the lack of resources that are being given to this committee to be successful. Community oversight means engagement with the community. And if you're unable to do that, then why are we even here? There's a lot to be said. It's not for you to answer, but this was just my observation. As I go out in the community and I have these conversations, now I can say, I sat here, I listened, and I will say one other thing as a leader of 30 some odd years. There's a sheer lack of professional acumen that I observe in this space tonight. And I'm not going to get into the details of it. But in order for us to prosper in unity as both an organization, a committee, we all have to work harmoniously and stop this tit for tat, kind of like gotcha. And it's very combative. And in the microaggressions and the rise and inflection of voices, it is not I work in corporate America. It doesn't seem like a collegial or a conversation that we're having. It's a lot of I gotcha. We have a role here, I think, as community leaders, and I wish you the best. I'm gonna, speak with folks in the community because you just sacrificed 3.5 hours of your time to do this work, and it's important. And I think ultimately we all are straight and going for the same thing, right? We want our police department to be the best in America. We want our recruitment and retention numbers to be off the charts, but we have to work together. And so I thank you for your work. Again, my takeaway tonight is that as the budget is ending, community engagement, we want to see y'all in the community. I know folks that want to see you in the community. All right, it's one thing to come in and have some chips and some water once a year, but they want to hear from you because not everybody in the community can be online. You need to go to community centers. You need to go to events. They need to see you. So I will implore and ask you to challenge your leaders and ask for that. So thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the police department for being here tonight. And thank you, Auditor, for everything you've been doing the past 2 years.
Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your reflections and look forward to additional conversation. Do we have anyone else online? I think we're out of time. So we'll welcome everyone to join us May 8th for another meeting. And I will hear a motion to adjourn early since we didn't address some of our outstanding items.
So moved.
Second? All in favor, aye. Any opposed, nay? Abstentions? Great. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time.
No problem.
Yes, thank you.